Blog Talk Radio.
Mi chiamo Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, Neye Ojira da, Medinde Ojira po, Kwesi Ra Nehem Pata Akan. Akwamumana Maruka Etipi Mu Ojira po, that means greetings to all Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people, meaning Africans, black people. Today is Ojira Day. My name is Ojira po, Kwesi Ra Nehem Pata Akan. Ojira po of the Akwamu Nation in North America. Yeda say we thank you once again for tuning in to the show. We are opening up the chat room right now. We'll be placing some links in the chat room for the information we will be covering tonight. A couple of the publications. If you have a question or a comment and you want to interact in the chat room, you must log in as a user to interact in the chat room. If you don't have a username, you can set up one very quickly in Blog Talk. And of course, if you have a question or a comment on the phone line when we start taking calls, then you can do that as well. You can hit the number 1 to let us know that your hand is raised. All right, so we're going to put a couple of links in the chat room real quick. The first one, and for those who are on the phone line, we have the publication, Amani Hunu, Overcoming Transcarnational Suffering. We're also going to put a link to the ebook version of our book, KOKOBO. Okay. And then we'll also put a link to the book, The Okra Complex, The Soul of Akanfo, in the chat room, and also a link to the publications page and to our Oklahoma Economic Development page. And what we're doing for individuals who are new to the information, new to the broadcast and so forth, we have 3 broadcasts on a weekly basis. On Joada, which is Mondays, we have Akanto Nanason, Ancient Authentic Akan Ancestral Religion. And we deal with the Akan tradition. In particular, focus specifically on the Akan expression of Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, or African Ancestral Religion, because, of course, in the Akan tradition, there's a great deal of misinformation coming not only from individuals in the Western Hemisphere who have been, quote-unquote, initiated to pseudo-priesthoods and priestesses and so forth and have a misunderstanding of cosmology as it relates to Akan culture, but also individuals on the continent who have been infected with Christianity, infected with Islam, infected with white culture in general, pseudo-spiritual practices coming from the whites and their offspring in different expressions. They have incorporated these infections into the fabric of the cosmology, into the fabric of the culture, and then it taints the culture. And then what they put forward as quote-unquote Akan culture or Akan spirituality or Akan cosmology and ancestral religion is a corrupted expression, an infected expression with a great deal of omission. Sometimes it's because of ignorance and sometimes it's deliberate. So we put out accurate information based on authentic cosmology, and we deal with that on Monday night on Joada for Akanto Nanason, Ancient Authentic Akan Ancestral Religion. On Awukuda, or Wednesday night, we have Egua, which is Marketplace, and we showcase Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit businesses, organizations, and institutions that are serving our community in a positive capacity, but also share our ancestral religious values and convey those values through their service and their products to the community at the same time. So we've had a number of individuals come onto the show. We're going to have more people coming onto the show, sharing their business, organization, institution, their products, their services, their philosophy behind the way they operate, the way they serve the community, and talking about their websites and institutions and so forth. So this is what we do on Egua Marketplace Day. And part of that process is what we have established as the Okom Economic Development Model. So we have published a model called Okom. Okom in the Akan tradition means hunger, but it also means possession. So we're talking about that constellation of needs that we must fulfill with regard to Ama Ancestral nation building, things we need to possess, the hunger that we have for independence and so forth, Okom, as well as the Okom, the notion of possession. So the Okom Economic Development Model is a model based on us engaging in economic activity in a harmonious fashion rooted in our ancestral religious cultural values. We have published that model. You can download that entire model from the Okom page on the website, also on the Okom page. And part of that model is not only the philosophy behind economic development from an ancestral Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, or African ancestral religious perspective, a grounded perspective, but also a specific strategy. And the strategy is to starve the beast and feed the pride. So we make an assessment on a weekly basis to determine what money we potentially would have spent with the whites and their offspring, wasted at various businesses, whether it's businesses, stores like Walmart or Starbucks or McDonald's or wherever. Money we waste, we starve the white beef, starve that beef, take those funds that we would have spent there, take that $5 or $10 and so forth, and feed the pride. Reallocate those funds and return them to the Afurakani or Afuraitkaitnit business, organization, or institution of the week. So that's what we get into. So that's the strategy, starving the beast and feeding the pride. When you go to the Okom Economic Development page, what you'll find is the publication, Okom Economic Development Model. You can download that for free, of course. A 4-part series on the model where we did on Blog Talk, where we went through details throughout the entire economic development model, delineated the details of that model and its application. And then also you will see a list of the various businesses. This list of businesses, organizations, and institutions is growing. And you'll be able to link to those websites, go directly to their website. Also, you'll be able to link to the interviews that they did with us on our Blog Talk radio broadcast. So they sat with us for 2 hours, talked about their business, organization, institution, products and services, and so forth. So you can access the interview, access their websites, and so forth. We are targeting one business per week for 52 weeks. We are in week number 12. And for this week, the business of the week is What's in Your Womb, owned by our sister Ma'at Ma'akeru Amen. She's published the book. What's in Your Womb is dealing with a holistic approach to dealing with womb wellness, physically and spiritually, emotionally, and so forth. Very important book, and we, of course, recommend that all Afuraitkaitnit women, girls, and adults get a copy of that publication. And they also have the Ma'at Foundation and a number of different things that they are working on. So that is the business of the week. What's in Your Womb? You can go directly to the Okom Economic Development website. We put the link in the chat room, the Okom page on the ODWIRA website, and you can get to that business. Please make your donations, starve the beast, and feed the pride. All right. So, and of course on Benada or Abenada, which is Tuesdays, we have ODWIRA. The name of our show tonight is ODWIRA. ODWIRA in the Akan language means purification. It also means the celebration of purification. So, for instance, for many Akanfo, the New Year's celebration is called ODWIRA. Purification happens around August, September, October, depending on the calendar. For us in the Western Hemisphere, in the Akwamumai Namaruka Etikimu, the Akwamu Nation in North America. Our ODWIRA celebration is a 7-day celebration. It's called Obrajira Nananum Som, and we celebrate that for 7 days between September 16th through the 22nd, or September 17th through the 23rd. The last day of the celebration is the first full day of the autumn or Atemet equinox, the so-called fall equinox. That's the end of the warm cycle and the beginning of the quote-unquote seeding cycle. So the ends of the year have met, as we say, the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next. So that is our New Year's celebration. It is ODWIRA purification. But ODWIRA also means, in the language of ancient Kemet, Jira means purification. It also means a celebration of purification. So again, this term is not from simply the Akan people in West Afuraikai. We migrated to West Afuraikai, West Africa, directly from ancient Kanit, which is a title of ancient Nubia. We were in the Kanat land, or the Kanit land, and we called ourselves the Kanit people, the Akani people, just like we call ourselves Akan or Akani people today. We're the same people who lived in ancient Kanat, Nubia. Some of our people migrated north, participated in the settling of ancient Kemet, so-called Egypt. After the decline of the civilization, some of our people migrated west, reestablished ancient Akana, or the Ghana Empire, a couple of thousand years ago. About 1,000 years later, some of our people migrated from that region and moved further south towards the forest belt and into the forest belt and reestablished the Akana or Akan civilization in the regions of what is today's Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, or Ivory Coast and Ghana. And then hundreds of years after that, some of our people were taken from there and forced through the Musuo Ketie, the great perversity, the enslavement era, into the Western Hemisphere. And this is how some of our people, Akan people, ended up in North, Central, South America, the Caribbean, and Europe. So there's a direct migration and then later forced migration from ancient Kanat, the ancient Akana civilization, to the Empire of Ghana, later Akana or Akan civilization, and the Western Hemisphere. And we continued our ritual practices, cultural practices, ancestral religion everywhere we migrate. This is why Akan people still communicate with and invoke, possess, deal with through divination the same deities that you find in ancient Kemet, the exact same divinities, by the exact same names, with the same ritual functions in creation, the same sacred colors and so forth, the same divinities, Asar, Aset, Set, Nebet, Het, Heru, Het, Heru, Setchima, Sekhmet, Heru, Behudet, Ra, Ra'et, Amen, of course, Amenet, the great father and the great mother, the supreme being, these various divinities, Ma'an, Ma'ad, and Tehuti, and Teshat, and so forth, the same divinities we still invoke, we still communicate with, we still worship, they still possess us. We are named after these divinities because we practice the same culture. Our language is directly derivative of that language because that's the parent language from ancient Kanat and Kemet, Nubia and Egypt and so forth. So we're the same people. And we carried that same practice when we were forced into the Western Hemisphere, and it manifests in North America as hoodoo, which is called root work. It's also called conjure. That term comes from the Akan term undu, which means root work. It also means conjure, and it comes from the ancient term from ancient Kanat, undu, which also deals with root work, conjuring, and it's also a title of the ancient Nubia. One of the other titles of the land is Undu, or the Unduru land, and the Unduru people. So we still practice the same culture, religious practices, and so forth, unchanged for thousands of years wherever we have migrated. So when we deal with purification, we're talking about purifying the culture, purifying the ancestral religion, rooted in our direct ancestral blood circle. We have elders and elderesses. We have Nananum Nsamanko, spiritually cultivated elders and elderesses who are ancestresses and ancestors. And of course, we have Abosom, forces in nature. that are assigned to us pre-incarnation. Every Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit person has that. Before we incarnate into a womb, our sum or our spirit is drawn to the Great Mother, Great Father, Inyamewa, Inyame. We are infused with a krawa, a soul, a divine consciousness, a divinity that is assigned to dwell with us in our head region, to communicate with us and guide us throughout the course of our lives. That personal divinity, a male divinity if you're male, a female divinity if you're female, that dwells in the head region, that force in nature is your, in Akan we say the okra, male, or okra, female. It's called ka or kayat in ancient Kemet. It is called Orderi Inu in the Yoruba tradition, the inner Orderi, the inner head. It's called the Selido and Bodun and the Chi and Igbo. And we talked about that in detail last night with regard to ritual practices associated with the Okrawa, but we're going to get into some more detail about that tonight as well, because we also talked about Odine, psychosis, last night, which is rooted in some form of disalignment from the Kra, whether it's temporary Odine, temporary disalignment, or psychosis, or permanent psychosis. And when we're talking about the subject for tonight, dissexuality, homosexuality, that is a form of Odine, mental illness, spiritual illness, mental psychosis, spiritual discordance. It is insane. It is perverse, polluted. It is disorder manifest. And there's nothing that can be said outside of that. That's irrefutable reality. So, when you talk about Odine with disalignment from the Kra, there are various forms of Odine, and this is the one we're going to deal with tonight. So, first, let's get into one of the first articles we want to deal with. Actually, it's a section from our book. One of our books called KOKOBO, which means warning. And this book is a collection of articles that we've published proving that dissexuality, homosexuality was never accepted in ancient Kemet. Published these articles because, of course, the whites and their offspring seek to attempt to force this perverse behavior onto our culture, and then seek to claim fraudulently that our people were practicing this perversity. Of course, they all know it's inaccurate, but they would like to promote that false idea. We talk about dissexuality, homosexuality. We utilize the term dissexuality because it is more proper and fitting as a term, as a designation. Dis meaning not. So when you have disorder, then you don't have order. Order is not present. When you have dissexuality, sexuality is not present. There's no such thing as sexuality outside of the union of male and female. Outside of that, it is dissexuality. It is perverse. It is insane. So this is why we utilize that proper terminology and coin that terminology to utilize it to express reality. So we talk about the divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality in ancient Kemet. We're just showing that for thousands of years, this has always been a reality. This is a divinely prohibited, divinely hated practice, meaning the Great Mother and the Great Father, the Supreme Being, hate dissexuality, homosexuality, despises, rejects, repels, hates dissexuality. And that's a reality. Now, we're going to go through some of this information, then we're going to get into the piece dealing with Amani Hunu, overcoming transcarnational suffering. And the reason we're going to deal with these two in this fashion, and we're going to get into the publication dealing with the Okra, the soul of Akanfo, because we're talking about eradicating dissexuality, homosexuality through the practice of ancestral religion. The whites and their offspring have an agenda. Their agenda is to force this perversity on our community, to have our people embrace this perversity, because it disrupts and tears apart families, communities, and so forth. When you introduce perversity in the lives of the people that creates all kinds of disorder, all kinds of dissension, and a deterioration of family, of community, of life. And this is why the whites and their offspring would like to introduce anything that destroys our family. This is one of the major fronts on their war against Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. Of course, they use chemical and biological warfare to poison our people, to murder our people. Crack cocaine, heroin, pharmaceutical drugs, vaccinations that are designed directly to disrupt and pollute the melanin-dominant people, our people, of course. They use all kinds of strategies, physical and non-physical, to wage war perpetually against our people. The most effective means by which they can maintain control is to corrupt our minds. And number one way to corrupt the minds of our people is their endeavor to get us, lull us to sleep by embracing their pseudo-religious practices and the perverse culture that follows their pseudo-religious practices. And the whites and their offspring began invading Afuraitkaitnit, or Africa, thousands of years ago, trying to take control in ancient Kemet and different parts of the continent. They were typically crushed, destroyed by our military. It took them thousands of years to finally gain a foothold in northern Afuraitkaitnit, and that was because after suffering continuous losses, they began to try to infiltrate through trade and commerce, and began to seek out and determine what groups on the continent were already at odds with one another. What families, what clans, what nations, what societies, where were the divisions within the society? They would exacerbate those divisions, join up with one side to help them defeat the other side, and join up with the other side to help them defeat the other side. They engaged in those kinds of machinations for a century. It wasn't until they realized that we would never submit to their rules unless we believed it had something to do with divinity. We didn't submit to any rules unless it had to deal with divinity. We only obey the forces in nature, the supreme being. So if they could pervert the knowledge of who and what the supreme being is and what ancestral religion is, then they would have a pathway to control our population. So this is where they come in with the perversion of our ancestral religion, the manufacturing of pseudo-religion, fictional cartoon character deities who never existed in any form or of any race whatsoever. This is how they corrupted names and functions of deities in ancient Kemet in a major way after the Greek invasion and Roman invasions and later Arab invasions. They began to change the images first of the divinity from black divinities to various black sculptures and paintings and so forth of the Ntoru and Ntotu, the gods and goddesses. They began to put forward white images, changing the names as well. Osad, Oset, and Heru become corrupted into Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And then you begin to see temples crop up and shrines crop up of white males and white female Greek characters being labeled Osiris, Isis, Horus, as well as the various divinities in ancient Kemet. So first they begin to change the complexion of the actual forces in nature with these fake little sculptures, trying to insert themselves and their identity into these ancient divinities, which of course no forces in nature except the whites and their offspring. They only repel the whites and their offspring. The whites and their offspring are cancerous cells within the body of black humanity. They are a minority of cancerous cells, disfigured cells. It's like cancerous cells develop within your body. About 1 out of every 100,000 cells in your body becomes cancerous at any given time. The reason why you don't have cancer is because you have an immune system that kills those cells. It isolates them, kills them, and expels them from the body. The whites and their offspring are cancerous cells within the body of black humanity. The only people who were ever created are Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. And we were created, and that was the end of the creation of people. And then we began to proliferate for millions of years. A few thousand years ago, a small percentage of our people who engaged in perversity, disorder, who escaped their death sentences, people engage in rape and murder and child molestation and so forth, we kill those individuals. Those who escaped that and escaped into further up into northern Eurasia, they got caught up in the end of the last ice age, and they were isolated in those regions. When they began to return to the southern Europe, and then later into North Afuraitkaitnit, they had already lost their pigmentation. Prior to that loss of pigmentation, the spiritual degeneration had already taken place. They had repelled their own kra, or krawa, soul, divine consciousness. And we're going to get into that. We talked about that last night. We're going to get into that. But the whites and their offspring are cancerous cells within the body of black humanity. That means white Europeans, white Asians, white Hindus, white Arabs, white pseudo-Native Americans who are just Asian, white Hispanics, white Latinos, and so forth, non-black people, non-Afurakani, non-Afuraitkaitnit people are the whites and their offspring. They incarnate as spirits of disorder, as cancerous cells within the body of black humanity. So they are divinely rejected, divinely repelled, divinely hated. And of course we have our book, Madanechi, divine divine law or love and divine hate, where we talk about the two poles of divine order. Order is a manner in which things operate. Some things are accepted within that order, some things are rejected. Order in and of itself represents a specific form, a specific blueprint. This is why it's order. And certain things are accepted within that blueprint, and things that seek to circumvent that blueprint are stamped out. The expansive pole of order is law. And law and love is the same word in our ancient language. Contractive pole of order is hate. So through expansion, you incorporate things that are in harmony with divine order, and you expand your sphere of influence. Through hate, you reject those things, objects, deeds, or entities you need to reject that would otherwise create disorder within yourself, within society, within the community, within the world. Your immune system, for example, and lymphatic systems are the agent of the divine hate of the Supreme Being within your body. They reject or repel disordered cells and kill them in order to maintain the integrity of the divine order. The immune system within the great divine body of the Supreme Being is the male and female forces of divine hate. In Kemet, they are called Heru Bekudet and Sechima Sekmet. In the Akan culture, they are called Benna and Abena. In the Yoruba tradition, they are called Ogun and Iyami, Abeni, forces, male and female, contractive forces of divine order, the impressive forces of divine order, the divine hate of the Supreme Being. So in our book, Modernity, Divine Law and Divine Hate, we actually trace the etymological origin of the term hate. And it doesn't go back to Indo-European languages, it goes back to ancient Kemet, prior to the existence of Europeans in the world. That term, ket or chi, in ancient Kemet, is a portion and a part of the descriptive titles of Heru Bekudet and Sechima, as the forces of divine ket or hate, those who destroy disorder so that the integrity of the divine order is maintained. They are the divine immune system and lymphatic system within the great divine body of the Supreme Being. On the other side, you have the expansive pole of order, which is law or love, governed by Ma'al, the male divinity of law and balance, and Ma'at, the female divinity of law and balance. So the expansive pole of divine order is law or love, governed by Ma'al and Ma'at. The contractive pole of order is divine hate, governed by Heru Bekudet and Sechima. So we get into detail about all of that information in the book. But the key is the whites and their offspring seek to introduce disorder into our thoughts, intentions, and actions. When we embrace their pseudo-religions, which are founded upon disorder, and their fictional cartoon character divinities, who never existed of any form or in any race, that includes Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jesus, Yeshua ben Pandera, Muhammad, Moses, Aaron, Solomon, Sheba, Menelik, Bilal, Allah, Yahweh, Brahman, Buddha, and so forth. We have detailed how these characters were manufactured by the whites and their offspring in our book, Kukutuntun, the Ancestral Jurisdiction. So they seek to corrupt ancestral religion, and therefore, if we follow that corruption, we will not align our thoughts, intentions, and actions with divine order. We will align them with disorder, which creates disorder within our spirits and our bodies, and we're susceptible to being controlled. It's like if you take in, instead of good food, nutritious food, taking in vitamins and minerals and so forth, and pure water, if you decide you're just going to do crack cocaine and heroin and drink alcohol, and that's all you put in your system, you will compromise your immunity. You will weaken yourself. And when your immunity is compromised, then bacteria and other viral agents that normally would be repelled by your immune and lymphatic system will actually assault you and take you down. The whites and their offspring seek to introduce disorder within our families, within our societies, and the major weapon for that is dissexuality, homosexuality. This is why they prominently promote that. It's nothing new. The whites and their offspring have been promoting that for thousands of years. They sought to promote it in ancient Kemet thousands of years ago. Before the white Greeks came in, the white Europeans who had invaded the so-called Near East or Middle East over 4,000 years ago, they were trying to insert this perverse practice into our culture as well. But of course, we rejected it. So when we look at the divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality in ancient Kemet, we prove that. And these series of articles prove that. We're going to deal with the first one, a certain aspect of the first one. We're not going to go through the whole book because we just want to point out that divine prohibition and its ramifications. Then we'll get to dealing with the eradication of dissexuality, homosexuality rooted in ancestral religion. So first we deal with the divine prohibition and then how we eradicate that. The whites and their offspring want you to believe that some people are just born this way, this is natural. God made people homosexuals, that's insane. Brainwashed Negroes who call themselves Yoruba, who call themselves Akan, who call themselves practicing Vodou, who call themselves practicing the traditions of ancient Kemet and the ancestors who are promoting dissexuality and embracing dissexuality as something natural. They are absolute liars. They are lying on the Orisha. They are lying on the Abosom. They are lying on the Vodou. They're lying on the Ntoru, so-called Neteru, Netertu. They're lying on the ancestresses and ancestors of Afuraitkaitnit. So we're correcting that record, number one. Number two, the whites and their offspring want you to believe, want you to embrace the perverse notion that this cannot be eliminated. It can't be eradicated. Once they condition our people to engage in that perverse behavior, they want you to believe that that is all that's going to be able to take place from that point on, and that person is sentenced to that kind of perverse behavior for the rest of our lives. As a community, the rest of our lives as a community, we have to put up with that kind of behavior. In reality, people are being conditioned into that behavior, consciously through pseudo-spirituality, also chemically, but also a large percentage of our people, the vast majority of our people who get involved in that perverse behavior is through sexual abuse. 90+% of our people who engage in that perverse behavior is because of sexual abuse. And when that happens, that disorients the people. The young child or a person who's older, someone's raped and so forth as an older person, suffering from domestic violence, domestic abuse, different forms of violence, criminality and so forth, whether they're young or they're adults. The onset of this perverse behavior comes from that, that negative, those negative experiences. The whites and their offspring want you to believe that that's just who you are, that's all that there is to it, because they want to push as many of our people into dissexuality, homosexuality as possible. Number one, it destroys families. It opens us up spiritually to perverse, discarnate ancestresses and ancestors who are criminal types, perverted types, as well as non-relatives who are earthbound, discarnate ancestral spirits and so forth who are unrelated to us. It opens you up to the influences from these entities as well and creates all kinds of psychosis, all kinds of insanity. all kinds of mental and spiritual illness and spiritual discord. The whites and their offspring want our people to believe that they are sentenced to that kind of behavior. In reality, can it be eradicated? Absolutely. Has it been eradicated through the practice of ancestral religion? Absolutely. So we're going to get into that as well. So first, we're going to go through this divine prohibition, and then we're going to get into some information. All right. So in our book, KOKOBO, on page 2, and in this divine prohibition, it is found in the so-called, what we would call the 42 enunciations of Ma'at. Some people will say the 42 laws of Ma'at, or the 42 declarations of innocence, or the 42 quote-unquote negative confessions and so forth. Chapter 125 of the Runu Per Imheru, the so-called Book of Coming Forth by Day, or the misnomer, the Egyptian Book of the Dead and so forth. You can find this in the Papyrus of Ani in chapter 125, plate 31, or you can find it in various versions of the Per Imheru, or this Papyrus of Ani or Unefer or Next or whoever it is on high. You'll find these 42 declarations of innocence or enunciations of Ma'at. But we want to give a proper perspective about what these 42 enunciations are, one of them dealing with the divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality. Now, what we say in the piece, page 2, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, Africans, Black people, and of course we have a book, Afuraitkaitnit, the origin of the term Africa, where we prove conclusively that that term does not come from the whites and their offspring. We show the actual Medutu in ancient Kemet, the hieroglyphs in ancient Kemet, spelling out the term, referencing the first landmass of earth created by Ra and Ra'et, being Afuraikai. So this is why we utilize that terminology. Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit. Africans, Black people, have never accepted spiritually perverse practice of dissexuality, homosexuality. This is true today and is true in ancient times. The whites and their offspring as spirits of disorder continuously attempt to insert their perverse, sexually deviant practices upon Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, African culture on the continent and outside of the continent of Afuraikai, Africa. This is one of their various approaches to the corruption of our ancestral culture and thereby the spirit minds of our people. One popular lie that they tell is that the Runu Per Imheru, misnomered Egyptian Book of the Dead, does not ban dissexuality, homosexuality, when in fact it does. And we say below is an excerpt from what is called chapter 25, plate 31 of the Ani Sheftu, or the Papyrus of Ani. In this passage, the spirit of the deceased individual declares to the Ntoro, the so-called Neter deity, vocalizes Ntoro, that he has not penetrated with a copulator or penetrator. This is a divine prohibition against this sexuality. And in the Medutu, in the hieroglyph, the term Nuk, talking about copulation or penetration, the actual symbol, hieroglyphic symbol, is an erect phallus with fluid being released. Talking about I have not copulated, and they show that image, have not copulated with a copulator, meaning one with the same reproductive organ. So, which is absolute proof against dissexuality, because this is one of the 42 enunciations of Ma'at. Why is it one of the 42 enunciations of Ma'at that a person must prove after they make their transition, when they're being judged as to whether or not they will be accepted in the ancestral realm? Why must they prove that they never engaged in dissexuality and prove that to the gods and goddesses? This is why they must do this. In order to live in harmony in perpetuity after death in the ancestral realm, as well as during life, in the physical realm. The Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, or African black individual must ritually invoke the 42 Ntoro gods, goddesses who are judges of Ma'ah and Ma'at, divine law, in order to harmonize with the energy of the Ntoro, the divinities, the spirit forces in creation, the embodiments of divine order in creation, in order to harmonize with them. And remember, the Abosom, as we call them in our Akan tradition, the deity, the Orisha, as they're called in Yoruba, the Vodou, as they're called in Fon and Ebe, they're called Arusi in Igbo, they're called popularly Ntoro and Ntorotu, the goddesses and gods and goddesses in ancient Kemet, the spirit forces that animate creation. Just like your spirit animates your physical body, the spirit of a dog animates the body of the dog, the spirit of a snake animates the body of a snake, the spirit of a tree animates the tree, and the tree lives. When the spirit leaves and the tree dies, the spirits that animate the river, the ocean, the earth mother, the suns, stars, moons, black substance of space, atmosphere, thunder, lightning, and so forth, these spiritual entities that animate these physical features of creation, these are the spirits in nature, the goddesses and gods, the forces in nature, the divine forces, deity, that communicate with us, that possess us. Just like our physical body is dependent on the energy of the sun. Without the energy of the sun, you will die. Your physical body is dependent on the waters of the ocean. Your physical body is dependent upon the air and the atmosphere. Your physical body is absolutely dependent on the minerals, vitamins and minerals and so forth within the earth mother. Just like your physical body is dependent on these physical aspects of nature, your spirit body, your sun-sum, as we call it in the Akan tradition, Safu in ancient Kemet, the sun-sum, your spirit body is dependent upon the spiritual forces that animate these physical aspects of creation. They are the embodiments of divine order in creation. Amen and Amenet, called Inyame and Inyamewa in the Akan tradition, the great father and the great mother. Amen, also called Amen Ra, is the great father, supreme being, and Amenet Raet. Amenet, also called Amenet Raet. She is the great mother. There are two individual entities who function together as a unit. And since they function together as a unit to create, to produce, they can be called the supreme being. It's like a male and female must function together as a unit, two halves of a whole to create a child. They're two separate entities, but they are complementary opposites that unite and function as a unit, as a being to create a child. That comes from that foundational relationship of Amenet and Amen, Inyamewa and Inyame, Mawu and Lisa, or Mosu and Chukwu, as they call them in Igbo, and Mawu and Lisa, as they call them in Vodun, Olokun and Olodorun, in reality, as they call them in the Yoruba tradition. The great mother and the great father function together as a divine unit. The forces in nature are the organs within the great divine body of the Supreme Being. With the various Abosom, Vodou, Orisha, and so forth, they are the smaller bodies within the great divine body. The great divine body is the Supreme Being. The smaller bodies are the organs within the great divine body. And just like you have a body and you have smaller bodies that regulate order within your body, and those smaller bodies are your organs and glands and so forth, and they regulate order in the body, and they have children, which are the cells. And the cells support the organs and serve the organs, their parent organs. And when they serve the parent organs, they serve the whole great body, you at the same time. We are the cells of the great, within the great divine body of the Supreme Being. Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, people only, as well as plant life, animal life, and mineral life. So, the organs within the great divine body are the Orisha, the Vodou, the Abosom. They regulate order within the great divine body. Therefore, they are embodiments of divine order. They never circumvent divine order. They are the embodiments of order in creation. So this is what we're talking about. So in this piece, when we say in order to harmonize with the energy of the Ntorotu, the deity, the spirit forces of creation, the embodiments of divine order in creation, their energy is invoked, meaning called. The energy is invoked, it can be internalized, infused, and replenished within the individual, like a drop of water fusing with the river, harmonizing with this greater force, body of water in nature. So does the Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, or African individual fuse his or her energy with the energy of the spirit force in nature that he or she is invoking ritually. This opens the way for one to align him or herself with the divine order of creation. So just like you go before a shrine of a divinity, whether it's a shrine in a shrine house, or you go to the natural shrine of the divinity in nature, and you pour libation or give offerings, engage in ritual prayer, whether it's ritual song, ritual dance, or ritual prayer, and call on and invoke the divinity, the force of nature. And that force of nature will communicate with us. Sometimes the force of nature will possess us, and we will engage in spirit possession, whether we are in the Western Hemisphere in America, whether we are on the continent, whether we are in Papua New Guinea, whether we're in Australia, wherever Black people are in the world. Spirit possession is central to our ancestral religious practice because we're engaged in a direct relationship with the force of the nature, the spirit that animates that river, gets inside of our bodies and animates us and regulates our bodies and realigns our spirits with divine order. So when we invoke a force in nature, one of the aboson, we fuse our energy with the spirit energy. Just like a drop of water fusing with the ocean, we fuse our energy with theirs and we align with them. This is why we say this opens the way for one to align him or herself with the divine order of creation. However, in the process of accepting the infusion of energy, divinely ordered energy of the Ntoro to the divinity, the individual, we must reject perversity, disordered energy, which can manifest as a result of disordered thought, intentions, and or actions. The individual thus invoke, meaning we accept the energy of the divinity, the spirits of divine order, and we repel disorder. If you're operating in disorder and you invoke a force in nature and they enter into you and they align their energy with yours, you must repel disorder. The forces of nature do not dwell in disorder, they repel disorder. It's like we always use the example of two magnets on the table with the same polarities facing. If you move one magnet near the other one, it will repel the other. The forces of divine order repel disorder. So when you invoke them ritually, and you invoke one of the aboson, and you align your spirit, your energy with theirs, when you accept their energy and that alignment, then you repel disorder. You invoke them, you accept their energy, but you must repel disorder at the same time. Now, in the passage below that we quote from the Medusa, the hieroglyph, the individual invokes the Ntoro, the god Kererti, which is the Ntoro, or divinity of caverns and holes. The term for caverns and holes is Keret, the gateways to the spirit realm. And his title is Kererti. His title is He Who Comes Forth from Amentet, the land of the west, or the ancestral realm. The individual invokes or calls forth and accepts, receives the energy of the Ntoro, the deity, and he also rejects, repels thoughts, intentions, and actions that are repulsive to the deity, and thus repulsive to divine order of creation. He states in this text that he has not copulated, penetrated, entered the whole cavern, keret, of a copulator or penetrator. The only hole or cavern, keret, that a male should enter during copulation is that of the female whose cavern is the kaet. That's the title of vagina in ancient Kemet. It's also the title of the soul. It's also associated in ancient Kemet with the opening, the whole keret, to the duat, the ancestral realm, whose gate is Amentet, the land of the west, the land of the setting sun. So when you look in the 42 quote-unquote enunciations of Ma'an Ma'at, it's not just 42 laws, like I have not done this, I have not done that. That's not what it is. If you look at the actual text and the rubrics and the murals associated with the text, you see 42 deities sitting there. And the person is going before each one of the deities and invoking them ritually. Once he invokes them ritually, he or she aligns with that force in nature, and proof of the alignment through the invocation is, I have not, number one, they invoke the divinity ritually and accept their energy into their spirit body, and on the other side, they reject and show that they have repelled what the divinity repelled. So the text itself says, kererti per amentet anuk nuk, meaning, hail Kererti, the deity Kererti, he who comes forth from the land of the west. I have not penetrated or copulated nuk with a penetrator or copulator nuk. And again, when it shows an actual erect male organ, showing that I have not copulated with the copulator. I have not engaged in dissexuality. The whites and their offspring often attempt to translate this passage as I have not fornicated with the fornicator. They're trying to gloss it because they don't want to show that it's a divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality. However, the term nuk, which is noyek in Coptic, the late Kemet dialect, with the determinative of the erect phallus, the ka in Kemet, the erect phallus is called ka as well. Determinative symbol is not referencing fornication, it's referencing copulation or penetration specifically. So we show the actual image of the papyrus with the various deities sitting there. And as we said, they're often called the 42 Declarations of Innocence, 42 Laws of Ma'at, 42 Negative Confessions, and so forth. The spirit of the deceased individual actually invokes 42 different deities through ritual prayer in the sanctuary of Ma'ati, the dual hall of Ma'at, for purificatory purposes. The 11th deity that the individual invokes is called Kererti, and we just read who that divinity is. Then we say below is a close-up of that divinity. So we show the actual text, the actual papyrus, an actual photo of that papyrus with the writing there, and the image of that divinity with the invocation. And we just want to scroll down. You'll see that in the text. Okay, so we show that in that particular text. Just like we have shrines in our homes for the Abosa, in our Khan tradition. In the Vodun tradition, people have shrines for the Vodou in their home, as well as shrine house. In the Yoruba tradition, people have shrines for the Orisha in their home, as well as in shrine house, Ile Orisha, and so forth. So just like during the course of our lives, you go into the home of someone who's Akan, or you go into a Abosom Pie, an Akan shrine house, a shrine house for the Abosom, you go salute the shrine of the Abosom, salute that divinity. You invoke them through ritual prayer. And if they have more than one shrine, you go from one shrine, and people who practice, they know this. You go into someone's house and they have more than one shrine in the house, you go to the first shrine, you invoke that Abosom, salute that Abosom, you go to the next shrine, you salute that Abosom, you do that, and you also go to their ancestral shrine and salute them, thing you do before you sit down on the couch and start talking to people. The first thing you do when you come into a house, you take your shoes off, you salute the Abosom, salute their ancestresses and ancestors, and then you can engage in communication with your friends, family, or whoever you come to see. We do that on a regular basis. When we go to shrine houses for the Abosom, for the Orisha, Vodou, and so forth, we invoke them. We salute them, we invoke them. We align our energy with theirs. And when we align with them, their energy is purificatory. It realigns us and helps us to purge out disorder. So we do that throughout the course of our lives to maintain order. Ancestral religion, Nanasom as we call it, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, ancestral religion, is the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance. So through ritual, we incorporate those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to incorporate in order to align our thoughts, intentions, and actions with divine order. And through ritual, we reject, hate, repel those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to reject repel hate in order to restore balance to our lives when disorder has manifested, when imbalance has occurred. So we incorporate law through ritual, and we restore balance through ritual. We accept law, which is the expression of order, through ritual. Through ritual practices, we align ourselves with divine law, and through ritual, we reject disordered individuals, entities, events, ideas, projections, and so forth, so that we can purge ourselves of disorder, of pollution, and realign ourselves and maintain the integrity of divine order. The ritual incorporation of law and the ritual restoration of divine balance. Those are the expansive and contractive poles of divine order of ancestral religious practice. Whether it's Yoruba, Nanasom, or Akanfo Nanasom, or Eve or Fon Nanasom, or Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit ancestral religion, is the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance. So, when we go to these shrines throughout the course of our lives, we realign ourselves with divine order. The forces and nature are the embodiments of divine order and creation. So, periodically, we engage in ritual practice. The Abosom possess. They communicate with us via shrine consultation. They communicate with us at the shrines for our Okrawa, and so forth. We engage in ritual practice, giving offerings, ritual song, ritual dance, ritual prayer, various forms of incorporating law and restoring balance. We fuse our energy with theirs, and a purificatory process takes place. We accept what is in harmony with order, and we reject any thoughts, intentions, and potential behaviors from our spirits that have polluted us. We reject that so we can maintain order within our lives on a consistent basis. When we make our transition, and this is what this text is talking about, we go before these same divinities we used to invoke when we were alive. And we invoke them. So the first part of the invocation, when it says, Kererti, you're invoking Kerim Amentet, he's coming forth from Amentet, the land of the west. The first thing you're doing through ritual prayer, saying, Kererti, you're invoking the divinity, whether you say it through a ritual, in the form of ritual prayer or ritual song. Just like if you were in a dark room and someone began to chant your name or sing your name or just say your name, the sound vibrations themselves will provoke you to start moving towards that projection, those sound projections. They have provoked you. They've called you forth, called you forward. When we begin to sing or chant or pray with the names of the divinities, Kererti, we begin to invoke them, stimulate them. We project our energy out to them. Our energy provokes them, just like if you walked up to a lion and pushed the lion, your energy is provoking a response from the lion. That's more of a negative provocation. But when you, through ritual song, ritual prayer, even ritual dance, the energetic projections emanating from you provoke the spirit of the Abosom and provoke the response from them to you. And then they infuse their energy to you, and you align with their energy. Because they're embodiments of divine order, the only way you can align with that divinely ordered energy is if, number one, you fully open yourself to divine order and accept it, pull it in. But you must also reject disorder, or else you will be repulsive. You will be like a magnet on the table that's being repelled. If you reverse the polarity and the opposites attract, then the magnets jump together. When you reject disorder and you align yourself with order, you're like the magnets who jump together. But if you engage in disorder, you reverse your polarity. You make yourself repulsive to the other magnet. And the Abosom is like a huge magnet. And when you reverse your polarity, you become repulsive. And even if you try to invoke them, your invocations, your provocations, your energy projections are repelled. And they never reach the Abosom because they're sent right back. They're repulsed because you're engaged in disorder. But when you reject disorder, you reverse your polarity and you are drawn directly to and jump together just like the two magnets. You as a small magnet are pulled and jump together with a large magnet, the force of nature, and you can be purified through their dispensation of energy. Your spirit body, which is miniature, is purified by the great spirit body of one of these forces in nature. We do that when we invoke these divinities throughout the course of our lives. and then we invoke them when we make our transition. And as we invoke these various 42 abosomes, showing that we lived in harmony with them throughout the course of our lives, everything that you engaged in throughout the course of your life and how you lived your life is encoded not only within your DNA, but also within your spirit body. So if you purified yourself on a regular basis, and you had a pure spirit body, and you were fundamentally living in harmony with divine order, and if you made mistakes, you were sincere enough to engage ancestral religion, the ritual incorporation of divine law, and the ritual restoration of divine balance. You may not have been perfect, but when you made sincere mistakes, you engaged the ritual practices that were given to us by the abosome to incorporate law and restore balance, and then move forward in a harmonious fashion. When you engage those practices on a regular basis, you fortify your spirit body, you purify your spirit body. So then when you go before the abosome after you have made your transition, and your spirit is going before the same abosome you went to when you were alive, and you say, you invoke them, Kereti, you're invoking this divinity, you confuse with this divinity because they see that your spirit has been constantly purified on a regular basis, and you are seeking to reject disorder. So they will accept you, you'll be able to fuse with them, and so forth. And then you also show that you rejected what they reject. You repel what they repel. All 42 divinities have some, aspect of behavior that is rejected, certain things that are rejected. In this number 11, Kereti, the rejection is not entering into caverns that should not be entered into. You're engaging in proper sexual activity, reproductive sexual activity. So you invoke the divinity, that's the expansive aspect of the ritual, and then you show what you have not engaged in, that's the contractive. The expansive part is fusing with the divinity. The contractive part is showing what you repel. You invoke the divinity by name, that's a ritual invocation, just by calling their name. And then you say what you have not engaged in. I have not done this, saying I have repelled this. I have embraced law and I have rejected disorder. I've embraced order, accepted order, and I have rejected disorder. The invocation of the name of the divinity and you're seeking to fuse with them is the acceptance of order. Then you say, I have rejected disorder. Now that's balance. Then you move to the next divinity and engage in a ritual invocation, invoking them by name, and then also declaring what you have repelled, the same kind of behavior or disorder that they repel. And you pass that test as well. And you go through all 42. And after you go through all 42, then you're successful with that, then you can be accepted into the ancestral realm as one of the ancestresses and ancestors who are harmonious, who are cultivated, and so forth. This is what this text is dealing with. Throughout the course of our lives, it has important ramifications, specifically with regard to dissexuality, homosexuality throughout the course of our lives. As we mentioned in our broadcast, the 42 enunciations of Ma'at, when you have these 42 enunciations that are manifest as laws, these are not the only quote-unquote laws, these are enunciations of what we have done, what we have accepted that is orderly, that the deities accept, and what we have repelled. Because the deities repel these things. They hate these things. So, when it talks about I have not copulated with the copulated, one of the other ones talks about I have not stolen. Another one, I have not, killed someone without just cause. I have not done a number of different things. When we get to this one in particular, some fools will say, well, if you had to have a law in your society talking about you have not copulated with the copulator, you've not engaged in dissexuality, the fact that you had a law in the corpus must point to the reality that the behavior was so rampant that you had to establish a law in order to outlaw it and stop people from doing it. Now, as we showed in the previous broadcast, we will show how stupid that belief is. There's a difference between white culture and Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit culture. So when we understand our culture, we understand the reality. When you go before these abosom, during the course of your life, as well as after death, but throughout the course of your life. And you know what these abosom represent. You know that if you go to KOKOBO, then you say, I have not engaged in dissexuality. You go before another divinity, you say, I have not engaged in theft. You go before another divinity, you say, I have not engaged in murder or unjustified killing. You can have justified killing and unjustified killing. Unjustified killing is murder. So these various different things you say you have not engaged in. What is that saying? Number one is saying that the forces in nature, the divine embodiment of divine order, reject these certain kinds of behavior. That's number one. Number two, you're saying to them that you have not engaged in that. The third piece that's critical is that, and it's rooted in our ancestral culture, and anybody who embraces ancestral religion understands this from children to adults. If these laws are in place, if the abosom say that this is not what is correct, once you understand that one of the abosom in creation is a divinity that dwells within your head region, that means that divinity as well rejects disorder, all forms of disorder as well. So anytime you have an idea that is a manifestation of disorder, a desire to engage in criminal activity, because of the way the laws are set in place and because you have invoked these various abosom on a regular basis throughout your life, because you have consulted your own personal abosom that dwells in your head region throughout the course of your life since you were a child, and you know they reject perverse thoughts, intentions, and actions, then if you have a desire to engage in disordered activity, for example, dissexuality, number one, you know that that is not coming from the abosom because they hate that behavior. That's number one. So all of the forces in nature hate that behavior. So you know it's not coming from them. Of course, it's not coming from Nyame Wa Nyame, the great mother and great father and supreme being. You also know it's not coming from the ancestresses and ancestors because they hate that behavior. They teach us and guide us on how to live in harmony with the divine order, the forces in nature. So it's not coming from the supreme being. It's not coming from the forces in nature. It's not coming from the ancestresses and ancestors. It's not coming from the deity that dwells in your head region. So if you have a desire to engage in criminal type activity inclusive of dissexuality, homosexuality, if that desire arises, you know it's not coming from a divine source. It must be coming from another source. So you know that there's some discarnate ancestral spirit who is a criminal type, who is earthbound, still hanging around the place where they were killed, where they died, and so forth, or a discarnate spirit that's not a relative, but someone or some entity that you're receptive to. Somebody who died, their spirit is still hanging around the place that they died, or, terrorizing people and so forth who are receptive. So whenever some strange desire manifests within you, you can automatically understand it's not coming from the supreme being, it's not coming from the abosom, it's not coming from the ancestors and ancestors, it's not coming from your own crop, your soul, your divine consciousness, because that's a force in nature, an embodiment of divine order as well. So anytime an unusual thought comes forward that's in total conflict with what the abosom require, then you know it's a criminal entity. And therefore, you also know, because you practice ancestral religion, that you must engage in ritual practices to remove that entity, remove that discarnate spirit, and remove its influences out of your mindset and out of your sphere of awareness. So you engage in ritual practice. When someone in your family engages in ritual practice, they're clairvoyant and they can see this discarnate spirit hanging around the house. They engage in ritual practice to repel that discarnate spirit. It may be an individual who was once a child molester. Now their spirit is still pressing upon the person, trying to place in their mind certain thoughts about engaging in pedophilia. When that arises in the minds of somebody, then you automatically know this perversity is not coming from your own akra, because that divinity dwelling in your head region is a force in divine order. So this is what is part of our culture. And anybody who practices ancestral religion recognizes that. So when we look at our laws, this is incorporated within our laws. These 42 enunciations are invocations of deity, meaning we're dealing with spiritual forces in nature, the ones who maintain and regulate order, so that when you have an insane thought to murder somebody unjustifiably, to steal something, to engage in dissexuality, something insane, you know it's coming from a perverse spirit, and you also know automatically that you must engage in some ritual practice to repel that perverse spirit. Meaning that these laws didn't mean that the behavior was so rampant that you had to pull off. There's some behavior that people didn't engage in at all, ever. And this is a fail-safe against people ever engaging in them. So if you find out number 11 is saying, hey, when you invoke the divinity Kerati, you say you have never copulated with a copulator, and you say, well, I've never heard of anybody copulating with a copulator, never heard of anybody engaging in dissexuality before, ever. Have we ever heard of that? And everybody in the community says, no, we've never heard of that, except for the whites and their offspring who invaded a few hundred years ago, and some of them are still hanging around. They engage in perversity. So if one of them dies and their spirits are still hanging around in the country and still trying to influence people, when you read this law, then you recognize, wait a minute, this something is arising in my mind, this perverse kind of activity that nobody in the community has ever engaged in. It must be coming from one of these discarnate, perverted, deceased individuals. So we don't have to have engaged in the activity ever. This is a fail-safe so that if something arises that's against what the divinities say, you can identify it's not coming from the deities, and you can neutralize it before you even submit to engaging in the behavior thinking it's your own thought. In our culture, when we have unusual thought, if you're driving to work or walking across the bridge, we've given that example before. If you work in a high-rise office building and there's a bridge where you cross over the water to get to the food court, and there's the building that's a block away, and everybody goes there for lunch every day, and your life is going fine, but every time you walk across that bridge, all of a sudden you have an overwhelming desire to jump in the water and commit suicide. Now, in American culture, you go to a psychiatrist, you go to a psychologist, you go to a therapist, some fools go to a pastor or something like that, and start talking about, well, I've been feeling like every time I get near that water, I just want to jump. I want to commit suicide. And then they start trying to probe into what's been going on with your life and what went on when you were a child and all kinds of nonsense. They may put you on medication. You start having panic attacks. You get scared to go near the river because you don't know if you're going to jump. All this other nonsense, because we're not involved in real culture. If you're involved in ancestral culture, none of that happens, because when you cross the bridge and you have this unusual urge to jump, you automatically know, well, that's not coming from our own Akra. It's not coming from the Abosom. It must be some discarnate spirit hanging out on the bridge. And then you find out later that there was somebody who committed suicide who jumped off that bridge, and their spirit is still hanging around the bridge. And every time you walk by, because you're a little receptive, because you practice ancestral religious culture, you can attune to discarnate, disembodied individuals, and they're projecting their anxiety, their depression upon whoever walks by. And most people are numb to that, so they can't attune to it, but you're a little receptive, and you're picking up on the anxiety that this discarnate spirit is already having. So therefore, if you're involved in culture, you know instantly, oh, it was a discarnate spirit out there. You may cleanse your head to repel their projection, or you may wear something talismanic to repel their projection. And they know they can't mess with you anymore, so they'll start trying to focus on other people who are a little bit receptive as well. But you don't engage in the suicide, and you don't engage in some silly therapy once a week for the next 3 or 4 years and taking medication and all that. One ritual knocks it all out. You repel that entity backs up, they see that you can see them, they know that you know that they're there, and they back up off of you. And it's over. No more desires for suicide, because you never had the desire anyway. It was their anxiety that you were picking up on. It had nothing to do with you. People who practice ancestral culture, when some unusual thought arises in the mind, we automatically know that's coming from somewhere else, because it's not coming from the Abosom. It's not coming from our ancestresses and ancestors. It's not wired within my being is coming from somewhere else. So we automatically recognize that, and we neutralize it ritually, and we move forward, no sweat. So when you have these laws, this is what it's talking about. So when unusual ideas arise within the spirits of our people, we need to recognize, number one, what is our spiritual anatomy? And when we understand our spiritual anatomy, we know these unusual perverse desires are not inborn. They are not innate. They are not intrinsic, like the whites in our offspring would like for us to believe. That includes dissexuality, homosexuality, and so forth. So let's get into dealing with, first, a little bit with regard to our spiritual anatomy, talking about the okra, and then we're going to talk about transcarnational suffering, because we've talked about a large percentage of our people who are engaged in dissexuality, homosexuality. It came about through domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and so forth, whether it's children or adults. When that happens, it's not just the physical trauma alone. Of course, the physical trauma is a problem. That somebody gets assaulted like that is no different than somebody got stabbed or got shot. That's physical trauma. After the stabbing happens or the shot happens, they go to the hospital, get sewn up and so forth. If somebody gets sexually assaulted, they go to the hospital. And once the physical part is healed up, weeks or months later or a year later and so forth, then the spiritual or mental scars still exist. But why is there a spiritual or mental scar? Because the perverse energy of the discarnate spirit or the discarnate energy of the spirits that were dealing with the individual who engaged in that process, who forced that upon you, they're still plaguing you as well. So it's not you saying, oh, I think I want to be engaged in dissexuality. The kind of perverse entities, perverse discarnate individuals who are child molesters, rapists, murderers, and so forth, who are still hanging around, they have that influence where they begin to plant those kinds of thoughts. People who are in the family, people have uncles, aunts, grandparents. Some of them were good people, most of them, but you have some who are criminals, some who are discarnate, criminals. When they made their transition, they become discarnate. They're not accepted into the ancestral realm. They're repelled, like those magnets. They're spirits of disorder, and so they are repelled from the ancestral realm, so they're still hanging around. And they latch on to those who are more receptive than others. Most of our people, because of this culture, we're not very receptive. But those who are spiritually receptive a little bit, then they latch on to those individuals. Then they try to influence those individuals just like they did when they were alive. Just like they latched on to children or people who they thought were vulnerable or weak, they would try to go after them. They wouldn't go after people who are confident, somebody who would break their necks or kill them or shoot them or stab them at the slightest thought that they may try to engage in something. They would stay away from those individuals. They would seek out the people who they felt like they could control mentally, that they could prey upon. When they make their transition, those same perverts, pedophiles and so forth, will seek to prey upon people who are more receptive than the average person. If you're more spiritually open, you can see or you can hear, you can feel disembodied ancestresses and ancestors, then you're more receptive. But if you're part of this culture and you don't know anything about your ancestral culture, you just assume that when you pick up on people's energy, and some people are a little emotional, you can feel them, and that's all there is to it. But then when you pick up on discarnate ancestral spirit, you've been taught there's no such thing as ghosts, quote unquote. So when they begin to influence you and prey upon you and force their anxieties in you, force their depression upon you, force their perverse desires within you, you assume that these must be your own thoughts, because obviously any thought that comes in your head must be your own. You don't recognize the reality that these perverse thoughts are coming from this pervert, who, just like when he was alive, forced those perverse thoughts upon you and make you believe that you are a homo, make you believe that God wanted you to be targeted, and if God didn't want this to happen, then therefore it would have never happened, so you can't tell anybody, and all this other nonsense. Just like they tried to fill your mind up with that perversity when they were alive, they will continue to try to fill your mind up with that perversity after they make their transition. However, because you're caught up in this culture, this white pseudo-culture, you will assume that every thought that enters your mind is yours. White psychologists will tell you that every thought that enters your mind is yours, and it comes from something deep within you, in your condition. It can't come from anything else because there's no such thing as ghosts, because scientifically nobody's ever proven that they've ever communicated with a deceased individual. So, and they know it's not accurate, but that's what they teach us. Then we're ashamed to talk about what's actually happening. If we're hearing things, seeing things, feeling things, we don't want to talk about that because we'll be labeled crazy, labeled superstitious. Some people sent to psych wards, diagnosed with schizophrenia, misdiagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar, whatever it is, major depressive disorder, all these Axis 1 diagnoses and so forth. So we just assume, based on what we've been falsely taught, that every thought that arises in the mind must be coming from within ourselves. And if there's constantly this push, ever since we're children, all the way through adulthood, we have these overwhelming pushes for energy, a heavy energy, to move in the direction of somebody of the same sex. We just assume, oh, well, I was born that way ever since I was a child. I felt this. Yes, ever since you were a child, you felt this. But why did you feel this? And you can easily get rid of this perverse entity ritually, and you won't feel this anymore. Just like if somebody was constantly calling your phone and harassing you over and over and over again, you can say, I hear something in my ear every day, and the voice is telling me to do this or do that. Yes, it's somebody on another line telling you to do this or do that. If somebody goes and blows that person's brains out, then you won't hear those voices on the other end of the phone anymore because they're not calling you anymore. If a discarnate spirit is constantly trying to harass you and project perversity upon you and put this perverse negativity within you on a regular basis, once you neutralize and eliminate that spirit from your life, then you will not have those desires any longer. And it's over, no matter how many years it happened. Just like if somebody blew the person's brains out, his communication with you on the phone is over. If you eradicate and remove this perverse spirit from your sphere of awareness, then those projections are over. They were never yours from the beginning. That's the key. That's the number one key to dealing with these perverse desires. The whites and our offspring don't want us to understand that. This is why they keep us away from ancestral religion. Because when you deal with ancestral religion, you can understand the provenance, the nature of disembodied communication. When you understand the nature of disembodied communication, you can properly catalog and understand where things are coming from, how to sanction these communications, what to reject, and what to accept. Is it an ancestor or ancestress that is spiritually cultivated who is communicating with you? They will only communicate what's in harmony with divine order. If it's a force in nature, one of the abosom communicating with you, they will only communicate what's in harmony with divine order. They will never go against divine order. So any time you receive any projection or idea that's out of harmony with divine order, you know instantaneously it's a perverse, discarnate entity of a relative or a non-relative. So let's get into the nature of the crowd real quick, and then we're going to get into transcarnational suffering and overcoming transcarnational suffering. Some people suffer because of something that happened in this lifetime. Some people have had those things happen in a previous lifetime. They never healed from that. They return into the world, and they're still suffering from something that happened in a previous lifetime, simply because the same discarnate entities are still plaguing their family as well as them into the next lifetime, because those spirits have not reincarnated yet, or you have some other ones who are criminal as well, and they're still plaguing the individual. So we're going to get into that. But first, we want to talk about the crowd real quick. The soul, the divine consciousness, because it's key to people eradicating dissexuality, homosexuality. And that can happen, already has. When people embrace their ancestral religious culture, they can eradicate that behavior immediately and permanently. So let's get into that. That's one thing the whites and our offspring do not want you to know. that through your practice of ancestral religion, you can eradicate dissexuality, homosexuality forever. You know, a little bit here, a little bit there, and falling back in. You can eradicate it forever. You can repel these discarnate entities forever and get back to normal. So that trauma that you suffered, you can overcome that trauma. Psychologists, psychiatrists cannot assist you in overcoming that trauma. They don't teach you how to repel a discarnate spirit through evoking your ancestresses and ancestors and marshaling those forces to help repel any other entities around you. And then as well as dealing with your own cry and realigning with your own cry. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into our book, the Okra Complex, The Soul of Akanfo. And we're just going to go to the end. We want to deal with, we touched on this last night, but we want to deal with a specific section. If you go down to page 50 of the book, the Okra Complex, The Soul of Akanfo. All right, so we say, as we said earlier, first of all, the Okra male, Okra female, is force in nature. Just like you have a physical brain, there's a smaller body within your body, and it regulates all the functions of the body. It regulates the functions of all the other organs and systems. It dwells in the head region. It is an entity in and of itself, and it regulates the other entities, the organs and glands and so forth. In your spirit body, your Sun, you also have a force in the head region. And that spiritual force in the head region of your spirit body is your spirit's brain. And that is the Okra, male, Okra, female. The Ka and the Kaet is the deity that was assigned to you by the Supreme Being. So before you incarnated into the womb, your spirit was drawn to Inyamewa, Amenet, and Amen. They assigned the divinity to go, directed that divinity to attach itself to your head region in your spirit body and to dwell there and to guide you throughout the course of your life. Encoded within that force is a specific function you are to execute in creation and the manner in which you must execute that function, as well as the specific configuration of spiritual energy you've been given to execute that function and how to utilize it. So if you're we said you're a cell within the great divine body of the Supreme Being. That's what we are as Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people. Immune system cells in the body, when they see disorder, they move right towards the cancer cells, surround them, attack them, kill them, isolate them, expel them from the body. They're naturally inclined to do that. That's all they do. They seek out disorder and they move on it. If you are an immune system cell within the great divine body of the Supreme Being, you have that same inclination. You're governed by those forces in nature that carry that fiery energy. So when you see disorder in society, disorder in the community, disorder within family and so forth, you move, you're naturally inclined to move in a policing, military fashion to eradicate the disorder and the purveyors of the disorder. So you can maintain the integrity of the order of the family, the community, the society, the Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit society, and so forth. That's your natural inclination. That is wired within your crop, a divine function to operate within the great divine body. Some of us are immune system cells within the great divine body. Some of us are heart cells. Some of us are bone marrow cells, skeletal cells, and we're naturally inclined towards structure and establishing and engineering and so forth because we're skeletal structural cells. Some people are immune system cells. Some people are cells dealing with digestive systems and excretory systems and dealing with healing and so forth. We're naturally inclined to, when we see something imbalanced, disease, we're naturally inclined to move in that direction and bring about a healing effect and so forth, depending on what kind of cells you are in the great divine body of the Supreme Being. That determines what organ within the great Supreme Being body that you're a part of. If you're a part of the immune system within the great Supreme Being body, if you're a part of the circulatory system, you're a cell of that system or a cell of the, respiratory system and so forth, then this is what you are. You have that natural inclination based on what has been encoded within your krawa. That's your function. That's what you're inclined toward. It's always supportive of Nyamewa, Nyame, and Sheshe, or what we call divine order, always. So that's what the cry is, and that's encoded within your cry, your spirit's brain. You come into the world with that. You feel that inclination first as a pull within the head region. You can feel that force in your head region pulling you in different directions, always towards thoughts, intentions, and actions that are in harmony with your function and therefore in harmony with divine order. Sometimes what is called the first mind, say, I had a first mind to do this. Sometimes that is the cry. Sometimes it's the ancestors and ancestors, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's the cry. And the more you deal with your own cry ritually, you can determine the difference between when it's your cry pulling you to do something or if it's one of your ancestors or ancestors pulling you to do something. But when you align with that, you may be driving down the street, going in the same direction you're going every day, and the force in your head region directs you to take a different route today. And you're trying to get to work and you've gone the same route every day for the past couple of years. You have a strong pull in the head, turn away from this block and go in the other direction. And it's around 8:43 and you're trying to get to work, so you turn away from that block that you normally drive through and you go a different direction. It takes you longer to get to work and you're a little bit late. And you're wondering, why did I have such a strong pull in my cry to move in a different direction? And then you find out later that at 8:44, a minute later, there was a shooting on that block. And somebody who was driving in a car down the block, the car got shot up. Now, the reason why your cry directed you away from that at 8:43 because they knew somebody was out there shooting and so forth, and they were directing you away from that so you could maintain your functioning in harmony with divine order. And you followed the direction. That pull in your head led you towards ordered activity and away from disorder. This is how you begin to, experience the pull of the cry. The more you deal with the cry, it will become more than just a pull. It will be direct communication. The cry speaks. It's a divinity. It's a force in nature that communicates. It will show itself to you. This is why sometimes the cry is shown in the form of the individual's body in ancient Kemet, because it will manifest in different forms like that. So, and communicate with you directly, just like any other deity can possess and communicate with somebody. That force in nature, your cry will communicate with you as well. But initially, very often, it's experienced as a pull within the head region, communication within the head region, heavy pull or, directives coming from the head region and so forth, spiritual. Now, so your entire divine function is encoded within your spirit's brain. And we talked about that earlier. There is, however, the capacity that if you engage in disorder, you make yourself repulsive to Inyamewa Inyame, Diaboson, the Nananom and Samafo, which are the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors, and your own Okrawa, your soul, your divine consciousness. You engage in criminality, you reverse that polarity once again. So we say if you continue to dwell in disorder, the Okra or the Okra is repelled, similar to the repulsion of two magnets being placed together on a table with the same polarities facing one another. Until you reverse the polarities, the magnets will automatically repel. Until we reject disorder and realign with order, the Okra is repulsed and repelled. In this condition, we can manifest temporary Odine, psychosis. Indeed, psychosis is properly defined fundamentally as disalignment from the Okra. So when you go against the very divinity that dwells in your head region, it's pulling you in one direction to engage in thoughts, intentions, and actions on a moment-to-moment basis that are in harmony with your divine function, your very purpose for existence, and you go against that consistently, you become disaligned from it. That disalignment from your own soul, your own cry, your own personal divinity, that disalignment is the manifestation of mental illness in Akan called Odine. In English, that's psychosis, mental illness, discordance, out of harmony with reality. If your immune system cells, their specific form and function is specifically to execute immune system function. If they decide, okay, I am an immune system cell, that's the way I'm formed, that's my function, but I'm not going to do that. I want to do something else. I want to be a heart cell. I don't want to, some virus enters the body and says, hey, you don't need to be an immune system cell. You need to break out and be your own person, and you don't need to follow these rules, and you're a body cell, and you don't need to be limited to some specific role. You're part of a body. You can do whatever you want. You can go to the liver. You can go to the heart. You can go to the spleen. You can go wherever you want. You can hang out with the bacteria. You don't need to be locked in some little box that this entity is trying to make you become locked into. And then the immune system cells listen to the virus, the enemy, and they reject their natural function, the way they were formed specifically to execute immune system functions. They reject all of that, their reality, and they start engaging in behavior that's out of harmony with the reality within which they were created and formed. They are now out of harmony with reality. That is disalignment. That is, that is disalignment, that is insanity, that is psychosis. Disalignment from the crowd. So anytime we engage in any, form of quote-unquote mental illness, psychosis, whatever it is, at the very root is some form of disalignment from the crowd, whether it's a mild disalignment or a total detachment. Now, if one continues to dwell in disordered thoughts, intentions, and actions with deliberate effort, it's one thing to make mistakes. The crowd is pulling you in one direction and you make a mistake and you go in the other direction, or you're kind of compelled by lust and you kind of resist the crowd a little bit. You're disaligned, but the crowd is still working with you and pulling you, and you're pulling in the other direction. It's like a tug of war, so to speak, because you're just conditioned, controlled by lust and so forth. But if you continue to dwell in disordered thoughts, intentions, and actions with deliberate effort, like I'm going to reject the crowd, to hell with the crowd, I want to do something totally different, then the Okra will detach from the individual. That deity that was directed by the Supreme Being to dwell in your head region will separate from you. In the Akan culture, it said that in such an instance, Nekra Driani, his Kra, has fled from him. This is a grave situation which must be addressed ritually. If the individual does not ritually restore order to himself or herself and draw his or her Okra back to his or her Sunsum or spirit, the Okra will return to Inyame wa Inyame, never to return to the individual. There are three conditions that can befall the individual who suffers this permanent detachment from and departure of the Okra. Number one, the person faces imminent death. Once that cross separates and goes back to Inyame wa Inyame, like a drop of water returning to the ocean, they're like a spirit, a body without a head, a chicken with its head cut off, a spirit without a soul. They face imminent death. That's one possibility. The second possibility, they won't die, but they will manifest permanent psychosis. Once the crowd leaves and never to return and dissolve back into Inyame wa Inyame, you are now a spirit of disorder. You're a spirit without an anchor in divine order. Your crowd is an anchor in divine order. Now that it is separated from you because you persisted in disorder and repulsive behavior, thoughts, intentions, and actions, now it is separated. It is returned to Inyame wa Inyame, like a drop of water is returned to the ocean and is dissolved back into that great ocean of divine consciousness, the Okra, the Supreme Being. Now you are a spirit of disorder. You have no anchor in divine order. You manifest permanent Odine, permanent insanity. Various forms of psychosis, including certain expressions of what is called schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, other so-called Axis 1 diagnoses, etc. And as we say in parentheses, some expressions of quote-unquote psychosis are not really this. They're just simply caused by the influence of discarnate spirits and can be easily and swiftly neutralized. We just talked about that. Others, however, are truly manifestations of a permanent detachment from the Okrawa. So sometimes people are acting, disordered, schizophrenic manner because they can hear the ancestors and ancestors. They can hear discarnate individuals who are not related to them. They can't handle that communication. because they're hearing these voices. Sometimes they see them walking around. They see that nobody else is seeing anything, nobody else is hearing anything, and they get very depressed. They get scared. They get anxious because they know nobody's going to believe them. They get depressed, and they just want to check out of reality because they don't want to focus on the pain and the stigma and so forth, and they start rejecting just their basic everyday hygiene and everything else because it's too painful to focus on everyday life. So they engage in self-destructive behavior and spaced out kind of behavior and not focusing on, just like daydreaming on a regular basis. And people say, oh, they're schizophrenic. If they were able to simply participate in ancestral culture and everybody recognizes, hey, some people can see the ancestors as ancestors, that's not crazy at all. And if these are discarnate ancestral spirits who are not harmonious, then here's a ritual to engage to repel them so they won't negatively press you on a regular basis and you won't have a problem. Knock the issue right out the box. 15 minutes is done. So that's not really psychosis. That's just somebody messing with somebody, harassing somebody, and they don't know how to deal with the person who's harassed, just like a bully. Some children will break the bully's neck, body slam. The bully leaves at that point. Some people are fearful of the bully. They don't know that what kind of power they have, so they allow the bully to just harass them all the time. They get depressed and upset, don't want to go to school, and don't want to go where the bullies are and everything else. And it changes their behavior, and people saying, my child is depressed now, and I don't know what's going on, all of this other nonsense. But once you get rid of that bully, then everything returns to normal. And this is what we're talking about here. So there's a difference between permanent Odime, when the Okra is really detached from someone permanently, and that's real mental illness, as opposed to what looks like mental illness, but it's really just somebody being harassed, and they just check out of reality until somebody can assist them with repelling those negative entities. And number 3, so somebody can either die when the Kra detaches, they can engage, they can manifest permanent Odime when the Kra detaches, or number 3, they can manifest extreme antisocial behavior, externalized Odime, committing murder, rape, child molestation, various forms of criminality, perversity, dissexuality, homosexuality. The Kra has left. They have engaged in such criminal-type behavior that they've repelled that force of divine order that dwells within them. It left and it's gone. Now they're a spirit of disorder. They are a criminal. Now they engage in criminality, inclusive of child molestation and rape and murder and everything else, as well as dissexuality, homosexuality, and they promote it. Criminal dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty, spiritual perversity, oppressing other people and entities, displaying so-called psychopathic behavior, antisocial personality disorder, and so forth. They engage in all kinds of criminal, perverse behavior because they don't have an anchor in divine order. They engage in so much criminal behavior that they made themselves repulsive to their own Kra, and it detached permanently because of their criminality. So that's what happens. 3 different things that can happen. And we can see different people fit in those different categories. Some people manifest schizophrenia and so forth, and they just check out of reality because the Kra has separated, and therefore they just check out. You have other people who, because of their criminal-type behavior, they repelled their own Kra, and now they engage in that same criminal-type behavior, and they promote that criminal-type behavior and seek to perpetuate it. And the only thing you do with those kinds of individuals is we execute them, and that has always been our process because the Kra is gone. So they're going to continue to manifest that perverse behavior until they are eliminated. Now, the vast majority of our people, when we're engaged in foolish behavior, most of us are not in this grave situation where the Kra has detached and permanently gone. Most people, they engage in foolish behavior, lustful behavior, doing little ignorant things, lustful for certain things, and they go steal something from the store and get caught and all this other nonsense, or doing drugs and stuff like that. But they still have a Kra, but it's separated. It's there, but they're disaligned from it. If you can imagine the spiritual force outside of their head, but still near their head. They're not in alignment with it. It's still there, but they're not being led by it. They're not trying to be led by it. They're repelled by it, but they haven't totally rejected it. So they're not being pulled. They don't feel that strong inclination because they've engaged in disordered behavior. They're controlled by lust and ignorance and misguided conditionings and all kinds of nonsense. So they engage in self-destructive behavior on a regular basis. That's the majority of people who are engaging in foolish type behavior. The other situations are more grave. A very small percentage of our people who are engaged in that kind of criminality to the point that the crowd is totally separated, never to return. So, this is why we say while some forms of dying psychosis can be internalized, self-destructive, self-mutilating behaviors, suicidal, etc., some forms of ODWIRA are externalized, affecting the individual as well as others. Homosexuality, dissexuality is an example of externalized ODWIRA or psychosis, because again, psychosis is any disalignment from the crowd. So if you start lying to people because you just want to make them believe something that's not true, to make yourself feel better about yourself, that's psychosis. That's a mild form of psychosis. You're out of harmony with reality. You're not telling the truth. You're promoting something that's not real. If you operate out of harmony with reality, then you're engaged in psychosis. You're engaged in mental illness. We don't want to, face the fact that we engage in different forms of temporary psychosis on a regular basis. We want to feel like we're always normal and just those other people are mentally ill. But if you're lying all the time and want to make yourself feel good and, put on airs and all kinds of nonsense, that's a form of spiritual disalignment from the crowd. You're engaged or dying, temporary, mild psychosis. And it's not natural, it's not normal. It's not just being human, it's immaturity, it's idiotic, and it's a form of psychosis. This is why we have ritual practices, for example, in the Akan tradition, where we ritually align ourselves with our crowd. We wash the okra guade, washing our spiritual head, ritually on a weekly basis, to realign our thoughts, intentions, and actions ritually and keep us focused on a weekly basis. And some people on a daily basis, depending on what the need is. And then, of course, we have ancestral observances as well as observances for the abosom and so forth throughout the course of the year that keep us on track periodically, consistently, like a checkup on every 6 weeks and so forth. And within that 6-week cycle, another mini 6-week cycle to keep us on track spiritually on a regular basis. So we talked about that. Homosexuality, dissexuality is an example of externalized ODWIRA, a disalignment from the okrawa, which manifests in the individual and motivates the individual to conscript others into the ODWIRA, the psychosis. Homosexuality, dissexuality resulting from an Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit individual being victimized, for example, molested as a child, can be a form of temporary ODWIRA, a detachment from the okrawa, which can be corrected by realigning with the okrawa ritually. Otherwise, the okrawa, and we say the okrawa male, okrawa female, will permanently detach, and the ODWIRA becomes permanent. So the distinction we are making here, permanent psychosis, means that the okrawa is totally separated from you forever. Now you are a spirit of disorder and you engage in all kinds of criminal behavior, whether it's theft, murder, child molestation, dissexuality, homosexuality, and you're promoting that and trying to conscript others into it. Permanent ODWIRA. Now, some people who have been victimized and then they fall into that kind of behavior, that's temporary because their cry is still there. They didn't repel their cry on their own when they were children. It's what happened to them. Somebody engaged in that perversity with them, and now they've been engaged in the self-destructive behavior from that point on. Or even as an adult, somebody suffers from rape or something like that, torture, trauma, and end up in that kind of behavior for a number of different reasons. The okrawa is still there, it's detached, but it can still be realigned with. But if you persist in that behavior and decide, I'm going to do this, I'm rejecting divine order, I'm rejecting reality, you will repel your cry to the point it will return to Inyame wa Inyame, dissolve within that, and now you're one of these criminal type, permanent or permanent mental illness and so forth. Now you're no different than the whites and their offspring. You're no different than the KKK. You're a criminal in the community and are to be treated like the KKK, a criminal in the community. And you have some of these criminal, permanent, or dime type individuals promoting dissexuality, homosexuality in the community. These are not our brothers and sisters. These are our absolute enemies. And they're no different than the whites and their offspring at all. No brother, no sister, no embracing, no reconciliation. They are our absolute enemies who only deserve elimination. Now, and we also say the Sun, the spirit without an Okrawa is like a body without a brain. The individual manifesting this condition becomes a disordered, living corpse. And of course, that's like the whites and all of the whites and their offspring are in that condition. They don't have a Krawa. This is what distinguishes them from us. Now that you know about the nature of the Okra, a divinity that dwells in your head region, that guides you to live, in harmony with divine order, meaning you engage in thought, intentions, and actions that are in harmony with your function that you were assigned to execute in creation. That's living in harmony with divine order. And that force is pulling you in your head region ever since you were a child towards certain thoughts, intentions, and behaviors, actions, and away from other thoughts, intentions, behaviors, actions, events, influences, and so forth. If you allow other people to influence you away from your craft and you start incorporating those negative behaviors and influences and conditioning, then you begin to operate based on those conditionings, those obsessions, those compulsions, and so forth, instead of being led by your own soul, your own okra. And when your nananong unsumafo, your ancestresses and ancestors speak to guide you towards realigning with your cry, you reject them as well, and you follow these conditionings and these obsessions and these, things that you've incorporated into your sphere of awareness. And then you engage in self-destructive behavior, self-destructive activity. Now, the way to overcome that, of course, is through ritual practice, through realignment with the anchor of divine order, reattaching your cry, reattaching yourself to your cry, realigning with divine order. Now, we're going to get into the Amani Hunu, overcoming transcarnational suffering, but we want to lay that information out to show the differences between individuals, of course, who had the Okra detached and they become criminal-type individuals, and those individuals who are suffering from temporary Odime, temporary psychosis, because they've been disaligned from their craft. The number one reason we're disaligned from our craft is because we embrace white culture, white values, white pseudo-religion. When we embrace our own culture, real values and real religion, ancestral religion, we're aligning with divine order. And again, ancestral religion is the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance. So when we engage those ritual processes, we constantly are realigning our thoughts, intentions, and actions with divine order. So when people get involved for one reason or another into dissexual behavior, homosexual behavior, now you can understand they're engaged in disalignment from the crowd. Now that you understand that, that is the seed of understanding how to eradicate that behavior. If disalignment from the cry is the basis of the behavior, then a realignment with the okra is the means by which we eradicate the behavior. And the vast majority, 90+% of our people can eradicate dissexuality, homosexuality from their, because it's not natural anyway. It's a superimposition upon the individual, sometimes coming from individuals who force their perversity on the individual through victimization, discarnate ancestresses and ancestors and non-relatives who are still trying to influence the individual, living individuals who are constantly trying to influence the individual through media, through schools, through songs, through white pseudo-religion, pseudo-spirituality, and so forth. Anybody who's trying to control your mind with this white culture, whether they're white individuals or black people, which are crackers in blackface, basically, trying to control your thinking, control your ideas. They're trying to engineer certain beliefs within you. So when you start to think about following your okra and you say, hey, this sexuality is perverse, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And the first thing that pops up in your head is, well, no, the people, they said that we shouldn't think that way. Oh, no, we shouldn't hate anybody. Oh, no, I heard that we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't do that. That is programming. That is conditioning. The whites and our offspring seek to condition us into self-destructive activity on a consistent basis. So once you understand the nature of your spiritual anatomy, how these things come into existence, the difference between divine order and disorder, disalignment from the crowd being the basis of Odime psychosis, then you understand what is necessary foundationally, cosmologically, spiritually to overcome this kind of perversity. And that's true with any kind of perverse behavior, inclusive of dissexuality, homosexuality. So before we move forward, there are 4 minutes left in the online version of the broadcast. If you want to listen beyond 11 o'clock, you have 3 minutes to call in. So the people who are online, you need to get on the phone within the next 3 minutes, because online it will cut off. But the people who are on the phone will be able to continue to listen for the rest of the broadcast. The phone number is 657-383-0635, 657-383-0635. We're going to check out a couple of comments in the chat room. We have a couple of phone calls, and we're going to get into the overcoming transcarnational suffering. When we talk about these issues, we don't just talk about, hey, this is some perverse behavior, which it is. But the key is the whites and offspring have brainwashed even people who consider themselves Afrocentric or nationalist, Pan-African, or whatever. They still are controlling the minds of these individuals, because most of them do not embrace our ancestral culture, their own inherited ancestral culture. Ancestral religion comes through your ancestral blood circle. You're born into the world with that. Just like you said, we have an Okra, you have a specific function to execute in the world. You have certain Abosom forces in nature who are assigned to you pre-incarnation. Certain Nsamanfo ancestresses and ancestors who are assigned to you to guide you pre-incarnation. So you come into the world with a culture. You come into the world with a means by which you ritually align with divine order, ritually restore balance to your life. So you come into the world with an ancestral religion wired within your spirit, wired and encoded within your crop. So because many of these individuals don't embrace ancestral culture, they're engaged in secular nationalism, which is simply another name for white culture, or even messianic nationalism, which is just an expression of white culture in blackface. Then they, although they reject dissexuality, homosexuality, they believe that there's no way to overcome it. So then they've fallen into the trap that the whites and offspring set. You can't allow the whites and offspring to make you believe that they can just run and take over a large percentage of our population, and there's nothing that can be done about it. We're just impotent in the face of the whites and offspring, and we can simply, through ancestral religion, our people can restore themselves, just like people who overcome drug addiction. We've assisted numerous people through ancestral religion to overcome addiction to various drugs, inclusive of alcohol, marijuana, cocaine. And yes, marijuana is a drug for the Negroes who are still drug addicts and think that's a natural substance. We did a whole broadcast on that. Other drugs and so forth. All kinds of self-destructive behavior that's inclusive of those who were victimized because of dissexuality, homosexuality, child molestation, and so forth. And they're being plagued by these perverse spirits, and now they've incorporated this perversity as part of their pseudo-identity and operating based upon that. That pseudo-identity is fueled and supported by white culture. That's all by design, by the whites and offspring. Through ancestral religion, not only do we point out the fact that there's a divine prohibition against dissexuality, the forces in nature hate dissexuality. Now you have an option. You can stop that behavior today, instantly, and forever. Or you can persist in that behavior, and now you become an enemy to our community. You're no different than the whites and offspring. You're no different than the KKK, and are to be treated in the same fashion. Don't need any counseling. We do not counsel any dissexual individuals, homosexual individuals. You don't need that, and we don't do that, and we will not do that. You're an adult, and you can make decisions as an adult. Just like adults make decisions to stop, adults who are heterosexual, they may decide they want to become celibate tonight simply because they want to take control over their sex drive and start operating in a harmonious fashion and stop being promiscuous and so forth. So they become celibate instantly. They make a decision in 1 second. So they stop. And then they change their mindset, and then they only seek to connect with somebody who is their balance, seek to engage in a harmonious relationship that results in marriage and so forth, and then they restore a normal kind of physical relationship with their complement. Just like somebody heterosexual can do that, somebody who's engaged in the perversity of dissexuality can make the decision to be celibate instantly, in 1 second. And now that behavior that they were engaging in is over. The only thing left is the mental aspect and the emotional and spiritual aspect, which simply means it's time to realign with the crowd, reattach the crowd, and communicate with their direct, spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors. Yes, some of us have perverse, discarnate relatives, but you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. If you keep going back, you get into 512, 1,024, 2,048, 4,096. It keeps going back. Generations down the line, you have thousands and thousands of great-grandparents, and even into the millions. Some of them were honorable ancestresses and ancestors of your direct blood circle that have been trying to guide you harmoniously. When you align with them and you seek to begin to realign with the crowd, then it's over. The physical aspect is over as soon as they make the decision, instantly. The spiritual realignment comes when you make a decision to realign with your crowd. That does not require any consultation, any kind of counseling, none of that nonsense. You counsel with your own ancestresses and ancestors. You take control of your own life. So let's get into, I'm going to look at some of these comments in the chat room, make sure we didn't miss anything, a couple of phone calls, and then we're going to get into this notion of transcarnational suffering and overcoming transcarnational suffering. Various forms of transcarnational suffering, whether it's suffering from torture of enslavement, physical abuse, and everything else, inclusive of what happens with regard to people who are victimized through dissexuality, and that suffering goes from one incarnation to the next because things weren't taken care of before the person made their transition. So, wrote this article, Amani Hunu, Overcoming Transcarnational Suffering. We're dealing with all forms of suffering. This is just one application that we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so one question in the chat room, where can I find the 42 Confessions of Ma'al Ma'at with the Egyptian language along with the glyphs? I can only find the glyphs in English. One of them, if you get the Dover edition of the translation by E.A. Wallace Budge, he has the line of the Medutu, the glyphs. Under that is the transliteration of the glyphs in a line in the language of Kemet. And then under that, the third line is the English translation, laid out in that fashion so you can see line by line the correspondence between the symbols, the words in the language of Kemet, and the English words as well. You begin to study that way. But in that Dover edition of Budge's version of the Papyrus of Ani, it has a yellow cover with a picture of Anpu, so-called Anubis, but Anpu on the front cover. You can find that online, and it has, all what you're looking for. All right. So we just want to scroll up right quick, make sure we didn't miss anything else. Looks like we had a number of different comments in the chat room as we were going. Okay, so just give us a second real quick. So another question, if homosexuality, dissexuality is equal to relations between blacks and whites, with convincing black people that when they engage in acts with white people, they are really practicing homosexuality, dissexuality, be something that would be a problem of sorts. Okay, so what I think the poster was talking about is when you engage in dissexuality, that's sexual deviance, that's perversity. No different than bestiality, no different than any other form of sexual deviance. If you're not engaged with your complementary opposite, Afurakani male, Afuraitkaitnit female. That's the complementary opposite, the balance. That's natural. If you're not engaged in that, then it's not real sexuality. It's sexual deviance. Whether it's dissexuality or whether it's bestiality, whether it's child molestation, all those are forms of sexual deviance. But then when we talk about engaging in these acts with non-Afurakani, non-Afuraitkaitnit people, that's sexual deviance as well. Because you're not naturally drawn physically as a melanin-dominant Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit person. You are not naturally drawn magnetically, physically to a non-Afurakani, non-Afuraitkaitnit person because they are spirits of disorder and their spirits are repulsive, just like those two magnets on the table. So when you try to force yourself against your own cry to connect with one of the whites in your offspring, you're engaged in a forced connection. You know it's wrong. Your spirit is repelling the individual, and then you're forcing yourself to embrace them anyway and engage with them anyway because you've been conditioned mentally in a self-hating fashion by the whites in your offspring to engage in such activities. So that's not real sexuality either. Only real sexuality is manifest through the union of the Afurakani man and Afuraitkaitnit woman, period. So when people understand, and we talk about that in detail in a couple of our broadcasts, as well as dealing with the Okra complex and soul of our complex. So that's a form of sexual deviance. And the bottom line is, once again, the deviance comes in when you disalign from your cry. Your cry will only lead you in harmony with divine order. Thoughts, intentions, and actions that harmonize with divine order. That's the only kind of behavior that your cry will lead you toward. So if you go against that, because the whites and offspring have conditioned you to hate yourself and embrace these spirits of disorder, these discordant spirits of disorder, the whites and offspring, non-black people, then you're going against divine order. You're engaged in disorder that's deviant. All right. Okay, so we just want to get a couple more comments we thought we saw. Okay. One question, I understand that homosexuality is definitely wrong, but what about using sex for lust, pleasure in general, like casual sex, cheating, cut buddies, etc.? How is that viewed in our culture? And the seed of your answer is in the question. Once again, if you're engaged in any kind of behavior that is out of alignment with the pull of your crowd, that force in nature in your head region, that sometimes it really is the first mind, but sometimes it is not. But that force in nature, that divinity, that force in nature, that's an embodiment of divine order. If you engage in activities that goes against that, then you're engaged in disorder. So, of course, promiscuity is disorder. Lust is disorder. Lust is the perversion of order. And we talk about that in the Okra complex and other publications. Divine order governs all of creation. The perversion of order is lust. So we don't embrace lust. That's the perversion of order. We don't embrace malice. Malice is an evil intent to pervert or destroy. That's the perversion of hate. Hate is divine. Divine hate is the divine destruction of disorder for the maintenance of the integrity of the divine order. So your immune system and lymphatic system, again, are the agents and agentess of the divine hate of the Supreme Being. They destroy disordered cells. cancerous cells in order to maintain the integrity of the divine order. Malice is the perversion of hate. That's just an evil intent to pervert or destroy. So you're destroying things not because you're trying to maintain order, but because you're just perverted and just want to destroy things in an evil fashion. Malice is the perversion of hate. Lust is the perversion of law or love, because law and love is the same word, phonetically and conceptually. So we deal with law or love, divine law, the expression of order. And we deal with divine hate, the impression of order. The whites and their offspring deal with lust and malice. Lust, the misguided desire, a perverse desire, perverse attraction, disordered attraction. And then malice and evil, perverse intent to destroy, and so forth. So when we engage in lust, that's disorder. That's not part of our culture. It's Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people just in general, whether we're Akan, Yoruba, wherever we are, anywhere in the world, black people. We are spirits of order. Your Okra is your anchor in divine order. So anything that puts you outside of order is out of harmony with our culture. Our culture is a manifestation of divine order. Okay, so a couple more questions in here in the chat room. Then we had a couple of phone calls, and then we're going to get into the transcarnational, overcoming transcarnational stuff. So just give me a second. We're just scrolling through. All right, and I think we did that. Okay, another question. I've noticed a pattern whereby I tend to encounter women who consider themselves, quote unquote, bisexual based on what has been stated so far. These women have a greater degree of sensitivity to the thoughts and emotions of others. So, number one, bisexuality is a manifestation of that same perversity. It's nothing natural. You have some idiots, some Negroes talking about most black women are intrinsically bisexual. These are perverts themselves who are promoting that foolishness. When people engage in bisexuality, they're engaged in sexual deviance. They're repelling their own cry or cry for one reason or another, whether it's because of child molestation, sexual abuse, and so forth, or they're just totally controlled, adhering to white culture, which means disorder, spiritual disorder. When you embrace white culture, you're embracing disorder. The whites and their offspring, physically, whether it's through media, schools, churches, mosques, whatever it is, government, magazines, music, they're constantly projecting energy, thoughts, intentions, ideas, projections, trying to control your mindset. Some people may think, well, they can't control my mindset by, projecting, by using music or using, images on television. In reality, they can, and you actually demonstrated that whether you knew it or not. If you listen to a song on the radio in the morning, a song that you do not like, you hate that song, you tell your friends, oh, I hate this song. Every time I hear it, I just want to change the channel. It sounds stupid. I hate it. You hear it in the morning when you're getting ready for work, and then you catch yourself all day long humming that song. And then you tell people, that song keeps playing in my head. I can't get it out of my head. I keep catching myself singing that song. If it is a song that you hate, you despise, why do you keep humming the song and you're not trying? You have to stop yourself from humming it, because those sound vibrations were programmed into your spirit at a receptive point. And then once it was locked in, just like a programming your computer, your spirit is running off of that program. You have just been programmed. That's what radio programming really means. Then later on, you may start saying, oh, well, that's my song. I used to hate it, but now I like it. The whites and offspring understand how to program the spirits of people through sound vibrations. So they constantly flood you with sound vibrations over and over and over again, as well as images, to the point where you accept it, and then you start creating a pseudo desire for it. No different than addiction. You put crack cocaine in your body rejects it, it suffers. after a while, you keep forcing that perversity within your system, and your system is trying to fight back. And you say you're building up a tolerance. It's not really a tolerance, but your body is trying to survive. And you keep trying to force these chemicals in you. You force hybridization to take place between your cells and these chemicals, and then your body begins an artificial craving for the thing that's actually destroying it. It's not a natural craving. Your body would never naturally crave something that's actually destroying it. So it's an artificial craving based on the chemical that was placed in your system and infused itself within your cell. The same thing happens with these sound vibrations. The same thing happens with images. You may have been watching television or listening to the radio, maybe watching television or looking at the computer, and then you fall asleep. And then you have a dream about the individuals you saw on the computer or saw on the television. You're engaging them in a dream. You didn't come up with that idea. That was programmed into your spirit. And now your spirit is running off of those programs. So, media, songs, pseudo-religious practices where people start praying and becoming receptive to nonsense, and they allow themselves to be programmed, and then they start running off of these programs. These are the ways that the whites and offspring program our people to embrace self-destructive ideas and then feel bad if they go against the self-destructive ideas they've been programmed with. So whether somebody was physically assaulted, sexually assaulted, and that trauma was the basis of them being receptive to perverse entities that make them feel like they want to be engaged in perverse sexual activity, or just through living in this culture and being exposed to that perversity, or through chemical and biological warfare, the estrogens, the phytoestrogens that the whites and offspring pump into the soil, into the plant life and mineral life and so forth, and processed foods to increase levels of estrogen to push people chemically towards negative desire and so forth, disrupt their brain cells, disrupt cells in their body and so forth. All of that is done. So some people are moving in that direction based on, bottom line, white influence. But the bottom line, this bisexuality is just as perverse. You're still engaged in perversity. So those people are now more receptive to people in general. They would have been receptive just by virtue of the fact that they're receptive. But if they embrace white culture, now they make themselves receptive to perversity, and then they reject divine order. Because if they're receptive to discarnate entities, they can also be receptive to the abosom. They can also be receptive to the Ono Kra. They can also be receptive to their ancestresses and ancestors who are constantly telling them to stop engaging in bisexuality, which is still sexual deviance. But then they reject those communications and only embrace the ones that the whites and their offspring sanction. So that bisexuality is perversity. It's just a form of dissexuality. All right. So I thought I saw one more comment. And then we're going to go to the phone line, and then we're going to get to the transcarnational trauma. Okay. So give me one more second. Looks like we had a lot of comments, but some of them were not questions. Okay. Just give me one more second. We're still scrolling through this information. Okay, so individuals, okay, somebody just asked about the media. So, and we did, I guess we just addressed that issue. Okay, that couple of questions actually we're going to answer in this section dealing with overcoming transcarnational trauma, so we'll answer those there. One question, can we or do we pray in our common culture for people who are living disordered lives, and how? And this is just for Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit culture in general. Yes, you can invoke the Abo song in that process to help align or put pressure on those individuals, as well as the Nananom Nsamafo, to put pressure on those individuals. And just like the media, their messages are constantly replaying in the heads of individuals. Just like if you listen to the radio on your way to work, or listening to some nonsense, some black comic talking nonsense, and when you're communicating with other individuals, you'll say, I was just thinking the other day about what this comic said, or what this person on the radio said, or what this person in the song said. That means these things are constantly replaying in your sphere of awareness, in your mind. And just like they use the media to constantly convey these foolish ideas, use pastors in churches to convey their perverse ideas, this foolish culture, worshiping the whites and offspring as fictional gods and everything else, embracing these silly ideas and beliefs, and people incorporating these things as conditioning. In the same fashion, we can project our ideas, our values, divine order, and so forth towards these people. You can do so through the invocation of the Abosom in that fashion, and magnify your projections to these other people through praying to the Abosom and so forth, as well as the Nananom Nsamafo, the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors at your ancestral shrine, as well as at the shrine for the Abosom themselves. So when you pray, quote unquote, invoke the Abosom, you can magnify your own projections with regard to these individuals, even through meditation. Susu Hong, which is the term for meditation in our Akan culture, projecting those values, like if someone has a child or sister or brother, projecting those real ancestral values onto them, just like you would tell them something over the phone or in person. They may not be listening, but when you engage in ritual practice, you project those same ideas, same values, that same energy of divine order directly to them. They don't even realize that they're getting hit with these overwhelming desires to realign themselves and get their lives back in order. They don't know it's coming from you invoking the Abosom and magnifying your projections to them, but this is what we do. So not only do we communicate with them face to face, but even when we leave them alone, we communicate by projecting through the Abosom and the Nananom Nsamafo to put pressure on them as well. All right, so it looks like we got most of those, and the other couple, I think we will cover them in the section on the next section we deal with. So we have a couple of phone calls. We want to get to those real quick, and then we're going to get to this final section, overcoming transcarnational trauma, because that's a key piece as well. We've already dealt with the nature of Odaim, psychosis, mental illness, which is fundamentally disalignment from the Okra. Of course, the detailed information is in our book, The Okra Complex, The Soul of Akanfo, and you can also listen to the broadcast from last night when we talked about rituals to the Okra, a ritual to the Okra, cleansing the spiritual head, cleansing the soul and so forth, washing the soul and so forth. So we talked about the nature of Odaim, dissexuality being a manifestation of spiritual disalignment, disorder. If you persist in that, then the Okra will totally separate people who are in that condition. They manifest severe mental illness permanently, as well as criminal type behavior, which is still mental illness, disalignment from the Okra as well. But then you have people who have temporary Odaim, temporary psychosis, because they're disaligned from the Okra, but it isn't totally gone. It's just like disaligned because of victimization with regard to dissexuality, because of victimization, and victimization can come from sexual abuse, but victimization is also being forced to go to church, forced to embrace white culture, forced to embrace white values, embracing all forms of white culture, and that perverts the minds of our people to the extent that if they seek to embrace something outside of white culture, for example, you tell somebody about embracing divine hate, and they start getting nervous and scared to even say the word hate, and they want to back away from you because they say, oh, no, that's too heavy. I don't want to deal with that. That's too much. I don't want to talk about hating anybody. Those people have been victimized as well. The fact that you have trepidation, tremulous fear because of the word hate, you've been conditioned. in reality, hate is divine. So when you understand that, victimization also comes from the media, constantly brainwashing our people, pumping misinformation on our people, which affects their behavior, affects the way they think, the way they process information, even affects their emotions to the extent that they become anxious, full of anxiety, depressed, worried, fearful, if someone speaks to them or tries to encourage them to go against white culture and embrace their own. Embrace, even if they're like, hey, you should wear your hair natural. They start getting nervous and scared to wear their hair natural, literally, to the point that physically they're nervous. That's victimization. So that leads to temporary odine because of victimization. But when you have that temporary odine based on victimization, not because you were just simply desiring to engage in criminality yourself, but because you were victimized and then brainwashed, your mind is really colonized, that's temporary odine, and you still have an opportunity to realign with your craft, even though you've been disaligned, but you have an opportunity to do so, and that includes the vast majority of our people who are engaged in dissexual activity. But we had to give that background to let people know from the very beginning the divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality, coming from the divinities themselves. So all this information about this is natural, this is who you are, this is what you're born with, if you have it ever since you were a child, these desires, it must be natural and all this other foolishness, we knocked all of that out in the beginning of the broadcast, dealing with the divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality. So it's not acceptable, it's not part of divine order, it's perverse. And then how people get conscripted to that behavior based on victimization, based on receptivity to perverse discarnate entities. Then dealing with the notion of odine, psychosis, permanent as well as temporary. And then understanding that realignment with the craft is the foundation of eradicating dissexuality, homosexuality, and it's not a theory. Many people have done so already. So, and been successful at that, no different than overcoming drug addiction and restoring themselves from that point on and never returning to drugs again through practicing ancestral religion in its various forms. The same thing has taken place and will continue to take place. And after this broadcast, of course, millions of our people over time will overcome this perversity through the practice of ancestral religion, no matter whether it's Akan, Yoruba, Ewe, Fula, Hoodoo, Juju, Vodun, whatever it is. Ancestral religion, the ritual incorporation of divine law, and the ritual restoration of divine balance. That is the key to eradicating all forms of perversity, inclusive of this temporary odine, this manifestation of dissexuality, homosexuality, as a result of victimization. And of course, we also talked about this very small percentage of our people who are engaged in that perverse behavior because they are criminals. These faggots and dykes who are out here promoting this perverse culture on behalf of the whites and their offspring. Of course, Obama promotes same-sex marriage and all of that. This is the reason he's in office, to promote dissexuality. He would like your sons and daughters to be dissexual, faggots, dykes, and so forth, and condition them from 5 and 6 and 7 years old to embrace that perversity. He wants to look at your young 5-year-old son and tell him, hey, one day you can grow up and marry a nice young man, and pervert his mind from the beginning. So when they look up at a black-looking president and the president of the country is saying homosexuality is normal and is to be applauded, and they have this My Brother's Keeper program, the only reason that program is created is to promote dissexuality in the black community. It has nothing to do with helping African-American young men succeed in life. They only created it to promote dissexuality, same-sex so-called marriage amongst black males. Cracker in black skin was placed in this position to lull our people to sleep, make us embrace, to the extent that he could, dissexuality, as well as, the decriminalization of drug use and so forth, so he can have a nation of black zombies walking around, as well as a million of dissexual homosexual individuals. This is their goal, to destroy our people. They increase the death rate and decrease the birth rate. That's their number one policy initiative for black people. Increase our death rate, decrease our birth rate. For those who escape that policy initiative, the next piece is to increase our incarceration rate, increase our addiction to drug rate. For those who escape that, then increase our addiction to perversity, inclusive of dissexuality, homosexuality, all kinds of perverse cultural activities that create dissension within the spirit of the individual, within the family, within the Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit community, increase our addiction to pseudo-religions, white fake divinities, all kinds of nonsense. This is what the whites and their offspring, this is what their plans for our people are. This is the perpetual plan of the whites and their offspring to keep us under control. So that's all victimization. So we've shown how to, overcome these various things, whether it's victimization through direct sexual abuse, physical abuse, torture, and so forth. Even if it's not sexual abuse, physical abuse, torture can lead people to suffer so much that they want to turn against the gender that did all of the torturing. So a young woman has been tortured and beaten and made to suffer under a father or an uncle or another male, and then they're conditioned by the whites and their offspring in this society to think that dissexuality is a natural option. They hate the males in general, and then they move towards the female. And as soon as one female touches them, then they're like, well, I must be dissexual. There's no turning back now. And then they self-medicate and try to wrap their minds around this new perverse lifestyle because they think there's no realigning. And everybody in their lives, whether it's teachers, psychologists, so-called spiritualists, will all tell them, well, this is who you are, and if you try to deny it, then you're mentally ill. To try to deny these perverse desires you have is a form of mental illness. The mental illness they will try to teach them is not the dissexuality. The mental illness is you rejecting you being a dissexual. This is how perverse the whites and their offspring are. So we can knock all of that out easily, instantaneously. Anybody who's engaged in that perverse behavior, the temporary or dime version of that perverse behavior, because it came into being through victimization of various sorts, you can deal with that directly by, number one, becoming celibate instantly. Then the physical part is over. And you have control as an adult over your own body. You can pretend like you don't, but any adult can become celibate instantly. Secondly, you begin to deal with your own ancestresses and ancestors. So we've got a couple of calls, but we want to also get into this overcoming transcarnational trauma piece before the broadcast ends. So we're going to take a couple of calls, and then we're going to move forward. Okay, on the phone line, number 0776, you had a question or a comment?
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that I was 0776. I'm sorry. First, I want to say greetings. Could you pronounce that that way term of how you say greetings? And is it Mikiyamo?
Right. That's it.
Yeah, that's the right pronunciation.
Right.
Okay, I just wanted to get make sure I had an understanding of that way of how to say it. So Mikiyamo to you, and I just have a real quick question. I was wondering about like Western astrology and like zodiac signs, and where does that stand? Like, for instance, like being born in a certain time or month, and having a governance of a certain zodiac sign and planet, or so to speak. Like, how does that feel with the culture?
Okay, so now the zodiac, and we did a couple of broadcasts. We talked about that in the context, in the course of the broadcast. And in fact, we did a show. There's a radio show, Journey in Rhythm, that we did this past Saturday before last, dealing with that zodiac. If you look in ancient Kemet, of course, when you see the zodiac of Dendera, for example, and then even looking back further beyond that in ancient Kannada Nubia, like Nabta Playa and so forth. Notion of the zodiac, the positions of the stars that influence upon us goes back to ancient Afuraitkaitnit. It doesn't come from the Greeks, doesn't come from the Babylonians and so forth. It comes from our people thousands of years ago. If you look at the astronomical zodiac, if you Google astronomical zodiac, you'll find the actual positions of the constellations and the length of time that they manifest. So there are actually 13 constellations that cross the ecliptic. There are not 12. A couple of thousand years ago, there were 12, but because of the precession of the equinoxes, the shift in the movement of the Earth, now there are 13 constellations that cross the ecliptic, and they're not all 30 days each. Like the shortest one is 7. One of them is 35 days. One is 32 days. One is 45. One is 25, and so forth. They vary. So if you Google the difference between astronomical zodiac and, astrological zodiac, the tropical and sidereal zodiacs are still off by a large percentage, and those are the ones that most people utilize. So if you look at the 36 decans in ancient Kemet and the deities associated with these different star systems, then you find specific divinities associated with specific constellations. The key, though, is that that's influential with regard to your behavior, but it's not determinate with regard to your behavior. What's determinate is the Abosom, the Vodou, the Orisha, who were assigned to you pre-incarnation that you were born into the world with, that define the function you come into the world to execute. Those are the forces in nature who determine the course of your life. Once you get here, based on the time you were born and so forth, those will have influences, but they won't determine your behavior. Just like when it's 100 degrees outside, that will influence your behavior. Or if it's very cold outside, it will influence your behavior, influence the way you feel, influence the way you communicate with one another, influence the things you do, but it's not a determinant with regard to the direction and quote-unquote destiny of your life. That's encoded within your crop before you are even sent into a womb.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
Okay. Medad said we appreciate the call. Okay, so what we want to do quickly, we want to get into a portion. I know we have a couple more phone calls. We want to get into this Amani Hunu, overcoming transcarnational suffering, quickly before the broadcast cuts off, and then if we have time to take a couple more calls after that, we'll do so. If not, of course, you can always email us your questions, and we can, direct you to the information in detail to answer your question. But we just wanted to touch on this because we talked about victimization, and people know about victimization and how that will influence people negatively in general. But we went further and talked about how victimization, just like someone having compromised immunity, normally if you go outside and your immunity is straight, then bacteria just bounces right off you. You can go to work, people are coughing and, have a virus and, congested, and you just walk around and nothing bothers you because your immune system is working properly. If you compromise your immunity because you're not getting enough sleep or not eating properly or not exercising, whatever, then, or drinking or doing some drugs or something like that, then your immunity is compromised, then you get hit with this bacteria, and now you're assaulted with it, and now you're sick, and you're in pain, and your body is full of aches and everything else. And the same thing can happen with your spiritual immunity. When you compromise your immunity, the same bacteria that normally bounce right off of you without effort, now it's able to infiltrate your system and cause you problems. Spiritually, when your immunity is sound, the discarnate type ancestors and non-relatives, they're constantly trying to communicate. Like the one on the bridge we talked about is constantly trying to communicate with everybody, but most people are repelling their advances without effort, just like your immune system, just constantly repelling them. They can't even hear them, can't feel them, can't see them, can't nothing. Some people are receptive, so they can see and feel and hear, but they still have immunity. So even though they can see an ancestral spirit, even though they can hear a discarnate entity, they also have immunity, and they repel the ones that don't need to be near them. And those perverse type spirits, they can feel that strong, vibrant aura coming off of somebody like that, and they back up off of them. But some people are receptive, number one, but their immunity has been compromised. And because their immunity has been compromised, they can see, they can feel, they can hear, and so forth, these different discarnate entities, but their immunity is compromised, and these parasites, these bacteria, can infiltrate and begin to influence them. Some of them can't see very well, but they can just feel, some sensations or some influence, and they, like we said earlier, they just assume that these ideas that they're feeling, that are welling up within them, inside of them, these desires, these thoughts, they're flooded with all the time. They just assume that it must be their own thoughts, and they must be going crazy. They must be having a change of heart in different areas. In reality, they're, number one, receptive, but they also have a weak immune system. And once that happens, then those parasites can get in, influence them constantly on a regular basis, and push them towards perverse behavior. And if the person believes that these thoughts are there, then they will operate based on them, and then they will think that they're operating on their own volition, and they'll say, this is who I am, and I used to not be very grounded in it, and I used to be, totally disoriented by it, but now I've accepted this, and this is who I am. I'm a dissexual and all the nonsense. And in reality, they have accepted nothing. They've been influenced by perverse entities, as well as conditioning, as well as the media and everything else, which are energetic projections as well. And they're operating based on that, and they've given up, and they've assumed that their thoughts are their own instead of something that's coming from somewhere else. And then they just resign themselves to follow that perversity. And then they try to paper it over, gloss it over by saying, I've taken control over my life. And in reality, they have not. And they're still depressed, and they're still self-medicating in different ways. But they're trying to put on a front as though they are happy with what they're doing, which they're not, because their cry is really disallowed. So that happens in the present day. And that, of course, leads to dissexuality, homosexuality becoming a part of somebody's behavior. But we also must talk about not only when it happens in the present day, but also when it has happened in a previous lifetime. The person dies in that perverted state where they're controlled by other people's projections and so forth. They die that way. Their spirit leaves the body. They were engaged in disordered behavior. They're still controlled by lust and malice and so forth. And then they're not accepted into the ancestral realm because they are repulsive. They're still engaged, and they're still making excuses, many of them, for this repulsive behavior. And they're like that deceased individual who was on the bridge who jumped. Their spirit is still hanging around. After a number of generations, they get drawn back into a womb, and this spirit is still weak. The spirit's aura is still porous. The spirit is still receptive, but with a compromised immunity, and they draw themselves into a womb of a descendant who is kind of weak as well, and into a situation where it's not as harmonious because the people are operating on a similar kind of vibration, that branch of the family operating on that low-level kind of vibration, and they're drawn into a situation where the people are not as protective of the children because of what they've done in their previous lifetimes as well, because of their weakened immunity, and they're drawn into a situation where they end up getting victimized once again. So let's look at some of this in this document. We only have like a little bit more than 10 minutes left. The document is Amani Hunu, Overcoming Transcarnational Suffering. We're not going to go through the whole thing. We did a broadcast on this entire document and went through the entire document. We just want to get to a certain section. This is what we want to get to. When we become disaligned from our okra, this is on page 3. No, I'm sorry. Hold on one second. Yeah, page 3. When we become disaligned from our Okrawa, we, through misguided thoughts, intentions, and actions, we place ourselves in disorder and will naturally experience the effects of disorder. If one touches a flame, they will get burned. If one ingests poison, they will become ill. If one projects perverse thoughts, intentions, and engages in perverse behaviors, those disordered vibrations are received by others, living and discarnate. Those individuals, living and discarnate, who are on the same frequency will be attracted to such thoughts, intentions, and actions. And the person who projects them, you then draw disordered individuals to you. Your conscious and unconscious interaction with them engenders more disordered energy, magnetism, disordered effects, etc. We experience this as amanihunu, or suffering, affliction at some point. Not only your own projections, but you're drawing other individuals who are on the same perverse frequency. Then you magnetically draw them to you, and you're drawn to them. Then you receive their perverse infection, and that overload of perverse disordered infections, you experience that as amanihunu, which is suffering or affliction. Ritually realigning with the Okrawa works to repel the negative, disordered individuals and or entities and restore a sense of balance. However, all of the damage is not immediately repaired. If one gets shot, the bullet being lodged in the tissue is a disordered situation. When the bullet is surgically removed and the person is sewed up, the immediate disorder has been addressed. However, the wound is not fully healed. Further infection could occur if one is not focused. Even if further infection does not occur because the wound is kept clean, the wound is not totally healed even when the stitches are removed. The body operates according to physiological cycles, and there will be a time period where the pain and some suffering will continue until the body can fully heal the wound. When we engage in disorder and open a wound in our kahibit, our aura, infection, disordered entities can set in. We can then suffer from various manifestations of such an infection, meaning their projections influence our thoughts and behavior. If we do not realign with our okra, the disorder will continue. It is akin to not addressing a pain and allowing the pain, the tumor, to grow until there is a crisis. Just as we can die from not addressing a tumor and find ourselves in the spirit realm, so can we die without addressing a spiritual wound or infection. We can later reincarnate, still not having addressed the infection, thereby remaining open to further infection. Yet we are newborn, so it is the responsibility of the community to have structures in place that can identify infection of the spirit and support a healing process. Structures include divination and other ritual practices. So many people die and they're spiritually wounded, and they die as a spiritually wounded person. They reincarnate spiritually wounded, open to infection. However, if you have an ancestral culture in place, because you're a responsible Black community, you can identify the spirits who come back who are wounded, and your culture protects them and helps them to heal those wounds as they develop, so those wounds don't get further infected. But if we embrace white culture, because we think that our culture is inferior and we need to be worshiping a fictional white cartoon character, then when these spirits reincarnate and they're wounded, we don't have anything in place to analyze the nature of the spirit who has returned, to see where those infections are and put things in place ritually to begin to heal those infections from day one of birth. And for us on the 8th day, the naming ceremony is part of that process to begin to realign that spirit with its okra, even if it was infected. So if we don't have those things in place, there's a problem. Our disalignment from our okra in the previous lifetime could have come about through ignorance, negligence, arrogance, immaturity, or through criminality. There are some individuals, for example, in a previous lifetime who brutalized people and seem to never have suffered for it, yet every person that is born is a returning spirit. Such an individual, because of his lust, is drawn into a womb of a descendant in a certain area and situation where he will ultimately have positioned himself to have a quote-unquote wonderful life for years until one day he is severely brutalized and paralyzed. In this case, the criminal has suffered the effects of the perversity he set in motion. He drew disordered spirits to him in a previous lifetime and continued to do so in this lifetime. So every time we see a person suffering, we have to be more cognizant. Is this a person who caused suffering previously and now they're reaping that, reward of suffering, or what is it? There are some, however, who suffer as children and adults because of a previous lifetime where an infection of the spirit was opened as a result of ignorance or immaturity. This is an indictment upon the entire community. We have personal responsibility to align with our Okrawa, yet we have a collective responsibility as an Omaina nation to have structures in place, culture, which will protect the people and place the people on the path to alignment and realignment with the Okrawa. That's a major function of ancestral religion. When we don't do so or are neglectful as a community, we allow individuals in our communities to fall into disorder, perpetual disorder, and then they die in disorder because we didn't have cultural institutions in place to deal with that, to heal spiritual wounds. They therefore return via Bebra, which is Akan for reincarnation, and some have the infection of the spirit that is still open. They draw disordered entities, parasites, to them, just like any open wound. They suffer from child molestation, abuse, enslavement of a village, and so forth. This is an indictment, once again, on our community, because we do not have to have this epidemic of people suffering in this fashion. If we put culture in place, we can identify who has spiritual wounds and put them in a position where they at least have that option to heal those spiritual wounds during their lifetime and before they make their transition. And even when people make their transition with those spiritual wounds and they return, if you have culture in place, then you can identify those who have spiritual wounds and begin that healing process before they get in a position where they can draw negative entities with them, and we don't even realize what's happening because we're too caught up worshiping a fictional cartoon character deity. We talk about if a 2-year-old walks out into a street and gets hit by a car, the community does not blame the 2-year-old. The community blames the parent for not having a structure in place whereby the 2-year-old would never be able to be in a position to ever be hit by a car. While the 2-year-old is actually a returning ancestor or ancestress and may have placed themselves in a negative situation, a disordered state in a previous lifetime out of ignorance or immaturity, thereby being drawn into a womb of a descendant, which will place them in such a negative situation, there still exists a communal responsibility to acknowledge this possibility and establish cultural structures to prevent such occurrence. And we give some more examples of that. And we don't have to go through the rest of this because we only have a few more minutes and you can read that, but the key was, just like you can have a physical wound, if you have a physical wound, if you don't cover that wound up, it's open for infection. If you have a spiritual wound, whether it's through criminality or through ignorance and immaturity, and you're suffering like that, and you make your transition, you can be born back into the world, and that wound is still open because when we make our transition, we don't become quote-unquote angels and so forth. Depending on what you do in the spirit realm, whether you engage in some spiritual development or not, you can be born back into the world with a spiritual wound. If we don't acknowledge that reality and have culture in place, then we have babies that are born, they are spiritually wounded. We don't recognize that. We give them Christian names. We participate in white culture and so forth. We neglect the spiritual wound of the child. We don't see the animal totems that show up, and we don't listen to the ancestresses and ancestors who are guiding us to protect the child and put cultural structures in place so the child is drawing negative entities, individuals around them. They're not able to repel them, but the people, the parents, other people in the community, they're also receptive to negative entities as well because they're not repelling anybody either. So they're allowing the child to be placed in a position where they're going to draw parasites to them, and this is what happens when some children get caught up with regard to child molestation and so forth. When we put culture in place, we can basically end the scourge of child molestation. There are different ways. Ritually, you put those cultures in place, but then also on the back end with regard to retribution. When you have policies in place where child molesters are killed, not given therapy, but killed every single time by the community, tortured and killed. Every child molester knows that if they even think about engaging in that behavior, they will be tortured and killed by the community every time with absolutely no escape. Then you will shut that down. And then those individuals who have those perverse desires will be thinking, why am I having desires that will actually get me killed? Maybe instead of acting on them, I need to do something to get these desires out of my head, because if I engage in these desires, I will be tortured and killed. You stop them from engaging those desires before they even move to do so. And then they will seek out some help. Then they will find out that the reason that they had these desires is because they're not even their own. They're coming from perverse, discarnate spirits, and they can repel them even. So, the broadcast is probably going to cut off in a minute or so. So we went through this information to give a fundamental cosmological foundation for understanding the nature of the spiritual anatomy, where dissexuality and homosexuality actually comes from. Dissexuality is a more proper fitting term because it is perverse, it is disorder, it is the nature of the whites and their offspring, it is a weapon of cultural warfare against our people. For those who have suffered and been victimized and fell into that behavior, they can overcome that instantly through engaging ancestral religion. For those who are engaged in that process because they have permanent Odyme psychosis, they're criminals, and they're seeking to spread that poison, that perversity, these are our absolute enemies. They're no different than the KKK, as we've said. They are the whites and their offspring. They're spirits of disorder, and anything that happens to the whites and their offspring happens to them as well. They are our absolute enemies. So there's no acceptance of dissexuality, homosexuality on any level in our culture, at any time, in any way. When you embrace real culture, real ancestral religion, you embrace divine order and you repel these perverse desires and you eradicate them. And there are people who have done that successfully, and it will begin to expand at the same rate that people begin to embrace our ancestral religious practices. So, yet I'll say for everybody tuning in, we will be back on tomorrow. Yebeshi Abio, we will meet again. That's up.